Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book-to-screen adaptation. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. We have made it to the finale. We have made it to the cottage. And by the time we reach this episode, I think it's safe to say the impact of this show is undeniable. Its success is not an accident. The hype is fully earned. This show built its reputation scene by scene, choice by choice, on character, on its trust in the audience, and on its incredible storytelling. It knew exactly what it was doing, and I have been so deeply impressed. For me, this season has been a reminder of how powerful it is to be truly hooked, not just by the flashiness of a show, but by every person involved in the storytelling. We watched these characters grow and stumble and fail and not know how to communicate, choose each other, and choose themselves in ways that feel very honest and lived in. And the story has given me that rare but really satisfying feeling of being emotionally invested from beginning to end. So today we're talking about The Cottage, everything that it accomplishes in its runtime, and why this ending works so beautifully for the show versus the book, and how it's going to set up the very highly anticipated season 2 of this phenomenal show. I have loved being on this ride with you. I'm so excited to break this down one last time. So without further ado, let's talk about The Cottage. What I love about Scott's MVP speech is that it feels celebratory, but also points out that progress still needs to be made, and that Scott coming out does not automatically fix things. And that's shown through one of what I think is the most important choices in this scene, which is the audio. Because before Scott speaks, the applause is not consistent. It's polite, it's loud enough, but then as his speech continues, the clapping becomes sporadic, hesitant, and you can tell that not everybody in that crowd is on the same page about how they feel about this. It's conveying and communicating to us that Scott's acceptance is somewhat conditional, because the league is celebrating him as an athlete here, but it's not necessarily negotiating his queerness or accepting it fully. And the discomfort kind of lingers in the room throughout the course of this speech. I think that's a brilliant choice because the show understands that just because narratively in this story Scott came out with Kip, that doesn't mean that the system in place, which is the league, is going to heal at the same speed. So Scott's changed something, yes, but it's not fixed yet. I think the acting in this scene is done well too because he's very much practiced. His smile is kind of practiced. His pauses are slightly long. He inserts a joke of, "It's been an interesting couple of weeks." We know from episode 3 that Scott knows how to work a room and he knows how to give a speech, but he also knows in this scene that this room is not the same. And he's choosing to be honest anyway, which makes it more sincere. When he says something else happened that night, I love that line because it implies that him being queer overshadowed the cup victory. There were a few whoops and claps here, but again, they're not unanimous. So that tells us that this room is split. And it highlights that even at the highest achievement of someone's career in sport or whatever, being queer then reframes that entire achievement, and that being the best in your sport does not necessarily protect you from being scrutinized. I also loved the line where Scott says the kind of language I heard on the ice and in the locker room every day, because it implies that everybody there knows this is cultural. He doesn't have to call out specifically what was said for everybody in that room to understand his meaning. And he's also highlighting that this is a cultural problem, not just a handful of bad individuals. And then he follows it up with, "It was a constant reminder that I was different." And it points out that to name himself as this thing would result in social punishment. I also really liked his use of the word exhausting here. He says, when you have a secret that you work as hard as I did to protect, it's exhausting. And I think that that's a great way to showcase that keeping yourself a secret is very, very heavy emotional labor. And then he follows it up with, it's also really, really lonely. And that reflection matters because he's admitting something that he's never said publicly before, but it also reflects on Shane being exhausted from hiding and Ilya being lonely, and that gets expanded upon in the long game. And those are two themes that we should see explored in much greater depth and breadth in season 2. The whole speech shifts when Scott says, thankfully I found the person who changes everything. So again, implying that sometimes the right person and being in the right partnership is the thing that can save you from all these outside factors that are hindering you being who you are. In the show, Kip is in the Kingfisher bar with his friends. He's in that warm lighting that we now associate with safety and chosen family. People saying him not actually being at the wards might have been a budget thing. I think it was kind of a conscious choice to have them be here. It doesn't feel incidental because we know that this is a space where his words are going to land fully. Unlike the audience at the award show, we have people here who are going to hear these words and have it mean so much. It also introduces the character of Kyle, and he's framed kind of in the middle. And that's important because he's a character from the book Common Goal, which might show up in season 2 as well. When he says fear is a powerful thing, that line is kind of doing double duty here because fear is the thing that kept him silent initially. And then love is the thing that gives him the courage to do this now. But it's reminding us that fear is exactly why Shane and Ilya are standing in the position that they're currently in. And the show is using Scott to say, this is what happens when you choose your happiness over the fear. When Scott says, you make me better in every conceivable way, this is when Kyle actually gets up from the bar and walks away. And in the book, he has a crush on Kip. Eventually, he meets one of Scott's teammates, Eric Bennett, who I did mistakenly confuse with Troy Barrett in my last video. And then it ends with him saying, I share it with you, Kip. I love you on the screen. Structurally, this speech gives Shane and Ilya a model because Scott didn't wait for the world to be ready for him to make this announcement. He decided he was ready, and now he's going to deal with the repercussions of that. And again, progress isn't rewarded instantly. What I love about this too is that we know that Shane and Ilya would have watched this speech, but we don't get to see their reactions to it, which leaves us wondering what they'll do with this information and his words once they're together at the cottage. The scene where Shane picks Ilya up from the airport has so much more context in the books than the show could provide. We can see that Shane's nervous because he's tapping his fingers here, but there's a passage that does so much work in helping you understand what he's really feeling. Because as Shane's reflecting on Scott Hunter coming out, he realizes that being gay is not the thing that would create a scandal between him and Ilya. The League might be learning how to deal with this new frontier, but they don't have a framework to deal with what Shane and Ilya are doing. And that only really lands if you understand hockey culture and the rivalry aspect and the fan ownership in hockey. Because fan loyalty is everything. We even hear Una talk about loyalty in this episode. And in hockey culture, rivalries are moralized. The fans look at players as extensions of their own personal pride and the city's histories. So Shane understands that fans would reinterpret every hit, every goal, every loss, and essentially rewrite both he and Ilya's careers if they were to ever understand that they had done this. They would question his competitiveness, they would feel deceived, and he knows that no one would understand because the League does not have a story or an example of two rival superstars who secretly love each other. They would take their relationship and flatten it down into what Shane describes as depraved hockey players who secretly slept with each other. So that's what Shane's dealing with by the time Ilya gets into his car. Shane knows that this world inside of hockey cannot let him have both things. So instead, they're choosing this temporary liminal space of the cottage. I love the audio choice here because as soon as the door slams, everything goes quiet and we get this very obvious feeling of them being alone. If you notice, Ilya tries to put his seatbelt on multiple times before he actually gets it to click into place. So that's our cue that he's also nervous, even though he's much more stoic and in his face you can't tell. That's a way to showcase that he's also jittery too. And I love this, "Is this a Jeep?" comment, because in the book he says, "What the F are you driving, Hollander?" And Shane is driving a Jeep Cherokee. Here we can see that he's driving a Land Rover, and him justifying it as practical and good in the snow is kind of a brilliant way to call back in episode 2 when Ilya goes to his house and he starts rambling on about his investment property without Ilya having asked. And also episode 1 when he tells him not to smoke there and Ilya says, "Okay." Almost every time we get this name card come across, it's been a black background. Here we can see that there's a sunset, and then we also get the sound of a loon in the background, which again, this episode feels like a very different TV show than the first ones, so I like that they included that here too. In the books, Ilya is actually very into sports cars, so him making fun of Shane's car is also a nod to that. This whole shot is done in front of a video wall, and I love this particular angle because it makes it feel more real because we can see the reflection in the side of the car itself. And the two of them are wearing sunglasses, which is very much a metaphor for hiding, but I also like that the camera angles in this car make it so that we can see under the lens frame to see Ilya's eye, but a lot of the time we cannot see Shane's. I think everyone can relate to this awkward feeling of being trapped in a car with someone for 2 hours, driving to a place and being alone with them for the first time. And I think this scene really captures that. Because obviously when you're reading the book, you're just reading the sentences that they're speaking back and forth to one another. You don't feel the silence in between them. The song that's playing in Shane's car is actually called Le Chalet, or The Cottage. If you can, go read the lyrics in English because it's so on the nose. And it plays over the scene and then eventually fades as though it's coming out of Shane's radio. And that transition happens as soon as Shane asks Ilya, "Are you hungry? We can stop and get something," because it's a 2-hour drive. They keep looking at each other at different times here. So Shane will sneak a peek at Ilya and then Ilya will look over at Shane. And this is when Shane says, "I think you're going to like the cottage. It's relaxing." And Ilya deflects by saying, "Oh, is that what we're going to do? Relax." For Shane, saying it's going to be relaxing and that he wants that is telling Ilya that he is bringing him to this place and not requiring anything of him. And Ilya's rebound with, "Oh, is that what we're going to do?" That's very much how he deflects vulnerability. And by now, we're 6 episodes in, we understand that. It's kind of him asking, "Oh, you think that's possible?" So when Shane says, "I'd like to relax with you for once," he's actually asking for what he wants, very subtly, which is, "I just want to be with you." And that's really all it is for me. Because he doesn't just want Ilya as someone to sleep with anymore. When Shane says, "I bought groceries so we don't have to leave or not leave much," on the surface that seems practical because in the cottage areas of Canada, you are very far away from a grocery store. It's not an easy thing to just go and get more supplies, but then you also need to frame it through Shane's autism and his personality because he's removing any sort of risk or stress or obstacle that could come up in this scenario. He's trying to create a world that nothing bad can happen in. When Ilya cuts him off and says, "Thank you for inviting me," this is one of the most important interruptions, I think, in their character arc because Shane's quickly going into planning mode and Ilya interrupting him is because he can tell that Shane's nervous and he is trying to offer him some reassurance. This is the first time in this episode we see him do that, but he repeatedly does it throughout the course of this episode. He's trying to say to Shane, "I know that this is a big deal and I'm happy to be here too." So when Shane kind of internalizes that and says, "I'm glad you're here," it's showing us that the two of them are getting onto the same page with one another. The me too, but also terrified, yes. It's Ilya normalizing that this is scary. He's trying to show Shane, you don't have to pretend like this isn't terrifying. You're not the only one. And it gives Shane permission to smile back. This is when you can see that their looks are synchronized finally. It's a visual way to showcase that now they're actually on the same page. They're aligned as they head to the cottage now. Every time historically we've seen Shane be vulnerable like that, he then tries to ground himself again and make himself feel safe. So in this scenario, him asking if anyone recognized Ilya is his way of doing that. And Ilya tells him, "No, nobody saw me." And then the conversation comes up about Shane's parents. And Shane says that he told them he was going to be doing a silent retreat, which is so funny because it is true what Ilya says. It would sound fake if it was anyone but Shane. Ilya bringing his parents up on his own first, too, is kind of a window into the later conversation that he has with Shane when they're cooking the burgers. One of my favorite details in this dialogue is Shane asking, "What, does that sound fake?" Because in Shane's brain, he's so literal. So Ilya saying, "Yes, it would if it was anyone but you," that is him saying, "I understand you. I accept you. I think you're endearing, not weird." This is also the moment where the music lifts back out of the car speakers. So we as viewers, we're no longer inside the vehicle. We're just kind of sharing that emotional beat with them. And then the hand holding. This is so deliberate. And Ilya is saying to him, "This matters to me." You can see him rubbing his thumb on the back of Shane's hand here, which becomes a continuity thing that we see over and over again. But to me, it's also him saying, "You don't have to control everything. I got you." And we see him do that throughout this episode, especially when Shane's parents discover them. He's telling him, "We're safe right now. Just enjoy this." And I love this shot because Shane's arm quite literally bridges the empty space between them. The door slam cutting the music is one of my favorite things they do in this show. They do it time and time again so well, and it's a perfect way to kind of punctuate the end of that scene. The outside world is behind them. We are in the bubble that is the cottage. We've arrived here. And to me, it's the perfect way to kick off one of the most impressive shots of this entire episode, which is this Steadicam shot that I'm so excited to talk about. The use of a 3-minute, 15-second one shot after Shane and Ilya exit the car and arrive at the cottage is so smart because it creates a sort of psychological continuity for us as viewers. As soon as they enter the place where they are going to be uninterrupted, the shot is uninterrupted as well. Just like the sound cutting out when Ilya entered the car, it cuts out as soon as he exits the car here. And we get this clever callback when we see Shane carrying Ilya's bags. Shane had been reading social media comments about him and Rose and how he would carry her bags, her hopes, her dreams. And here we see Shane doing that same action, but for someone he actually loves. And it's not for social media clout. There's no audience here. In the book, Ilya has the thought, "Holy shit, this is happening. There's no undo button." Shane makes a joke that it's because his ribs are hurt, which is keeping up with that kind of humor that they both dip into. It also brings them back to that shared hockey language they both speak. And playing hurt in the playoffs is actually very normalized in hockey culture. Most guys play through the playoffs with broken bones. What's so impressive about this one shot is how many windows there are in this scene that we never see the camera operator in. And in the books, as they approach the house, Ilya thinks to himself, "This is bigger than I thought," which we know in the show and in the books that he's watched the TV special on Shane's home. He knows what it looks like. He's fantasized about it. And he reflects that this feels like the first time he's in a place where he can truly let his guard down and not worry about being recognized. He has this overwhelming realization that he is in Shane Hollander's home. Everything he's already seen on TV is right there in front of him, and that's an overwhelming feeling. Another great choice in the continuity department is having him take off his shoes. We know he took them off inside Shane's Montreal apartment. We also saw Shane take his shoes off in the hotel room and offer to take his shoes off inside Ilya's home. It's another way for us to understand that Ilya pays attention to the small things. I absolutely love the inside of this house that they used for the cottage, and it very much mirrors how it's described in the books, with having an entire wall of windows overlooking the lake. And in the show, they reintroduce a kind of standing joke about Shane's real estate collection. And I loved that, again, Shane takes it so literal and says, "I didn't buy this, I had it built." And Ilya, who has watched everything there is to know about the TV special on this house, finally turns around to look at him and says, "Oh, I know," which I think is such a great way of showcasing the banter that the two of them share between them. As the camera turns here, we kind of get a preview of the path of travel that the camera operator is going to go through as we continue through this scene. And when we pan back to Shane, this is like the first time we really get to look at his outfit for the first time. And a lot of people have pointed out this is the same shirt we saw him wearing at lunch with his parents. They stare at each other for a beat until you kind of see Shane look away because he can't deal with it anymore. And then he offers to give Ilya a tour. And he says the word tour in the most Canadian accent. And this is when Shane starts getting fidgety. He's trying to offer anything to make Ilya more comfortable so that he doesn't have to deal with his own discomfort. He runs through the gambit of ways that he can take care of him, offering him food, telling him that he bought his favorite beverage, the Cokes, just like Ilya had done with the ginger ale. He tells him he has well water and points to the well outside. It's basically him saying, I've thought about your needs. I have done everything I can to make sure that you're accommodated and comfortable. And that's definitely a great example of his neurodivergence. He's an incredibly intentional host. By having Shane walk through the kitchen this way, he's putting a physical distance between them that happens in the books as well. And it also allows the camera operator to slice the room in half by cutting in front of the island here and give us this really great shot where we are looking only at Shane and Ilya is off camera. And this pause is really monumental, especially since we don't have any background music. It's just the raw audio. And Shane here is basically saying, this is all I have to offer you. Here I am in the open, unprotected and exposed to you. And we don't get to see Ilya's face here, just Shane reacting to his face, which is so beautiful. And this shot reminds me a lot of the one in episode 2 when Ilya walks up to Shane and he's off screen and then enters the screen. And we're just watching Shane's face smiling at him. What I love about his facial expressions here is you can tell that these are all involuntary responses, because you can see that as soon as Ilya initiates this cheek touch, Shane licks his lips and his eyes flick up so quickly and then back down to Ilya's mouth. A lot of that is written in the text and they embody it so beautifully. And in the book, Ilya reflects that the moment Shane's mouth opened under his, everything made sense and all of his nerves left him. This is where, again, the continuity and the choreography and the narrative and visual callbacks all kind of come together so beautifully, because the way that Ilya holds Shane's head, we have seen him do this before. The way that his arm drapes over his shoulder blades but does not grab him, we've seen him do that before. And all of that shows us that this is them falling back into their norm. This is one of the moments that the camera gets closest to Shane and Ilya, and for a beat, we start to separate from them again when Shane starts walking them backwards and into the living room area. Another detail I loved is that they include all the clumsy, fumbling, funny, laughter, awkward beats that can happen when you haven't seen someone for months. And in the book, Ilya reflects that they hadn't been together for months, and it was ridiculous because he hadn't been with anyone in that time, and for the first time in Ilya's life, he hadn't wanted to be with anybody else. At this point, he feels like he was going to burst if Shane didn't touch him, and he had not been able to stop thinking about that. I'm fairly certain Hudson and Connor had said that almost knocking the lamp over was not planned, but again, it adds to that really organic kind of clumsy humor that often comes with situations like these. And the Steadicam operator follows them into the living room. And then again, we're watching them from a distance here as they kind of reconnect on the couch. And the path of travel is really beautiful as it kind of orbits around them. And as with most of this show, the audio use here with really raw mics around them is so impactful too. It adds to us feeling like we're intruding. We haven't had any visual break to make this feel like we're watching a show. It looks like we're watching a moment happening in real time, and we can hear all of the clothes brushing against each other and the couch and their feet on the floor. That all adds to the intimacy of it. In the show, Shane actually says wait and puts his hand on Ilya's hand as if to pause him. In the books, what makes him pause is hearing Ilya say same. And I think the show choice to have Shane pause everything is really important, because at first Shane's managing expectations and he's being very vulnerable. And then Ilya saying, yes, same, but we have 2 weeks is him matching Shane's vulnerability and then being kind by saying, we don't have to rush this. We don't have to make sure it's the best thing ever. We have time. But Shane focuses on the wrong part of that statement. He hooks on to the word same. He's trying to figure out what same actually implies. He's risking rejection in the middle of this moment by asking, you haven't been with anyone lately? And in the book, he says, it's not a big deal, Hollander, relax. But Ilya says that Shane looked stunned and way too happy. So he's trying to, again, de-escalate. He's admitting that neither of them have slept with anyone since they were last together in Boston. And even though Ilya's trying to deviate back into being physical so that he can't, have any emotions hurt him. Shane saying really is a way for him to kind of say, so you waited for me. And then in order to join him on that, emotional footing, he says, I haven't either, not since the last time we were together. The implication of that is that they've both chosen each other without formally announcing it. And that feeling is overwhelming. So Ilya tries to move things along by saying, well then, he's like, okay, can you not make me sit in this feeling? But Shane wants to live in that moment because he's elated by this news. And in the book, Ilya describes Shane brushing a lock of hair out of his face, and he could only stare, mesmerized at Shane's face as he looked down at Ilya with so much tenderness. I think for Ilya, who has had his entire life mainly defined by love being conditional, this probably throws him off his axis. And again, I love that Shane really takes that moment to make them sit in this and talk about it and feel it fully, because this admission is kind of quietly confirming that their connection with one another is real, that them being intimate with one another also means that they care deeply about one another. And I also think in some part this means that they trust one another and trust one another with their feelings. To me, that's what this really tender, soft kiss that Shane gives Ilya means. Them being together in this way isn't because they want it to be urgent or hidden or secret or dangerous. It's just a blind want and need for the other person, not driven by physicality. One of my favorite moments in the book passage happens in this moment here when Shane says to Ilya, I have an idea. And we see him kind of settle in on top of Ilya closer so that they're fully laying together on the couch. And by the time we get to this point, the Steadicam operator has now put the camera above them. So again, we're very close for this moment because it's meant to be more intimate again. And in the book, Ilya says what with more bravery than he felt. I think him looking away here is meant to imply that. He's trying to be brave, but he can't meet Shane's eyes. And Shane says, let's be honest with each other. For these 2 weeks, let's just say what we're actually thinking. Maybe say how we really feel. And I love how in the show, he ends that sentence with a question. In the book, Ilya thinks to himself, I can't. I can't because if I do, you'll think I'm pathetic, or worse, you'll say it back, and then what the fuck are we supposed to do? So he is ready to say, I love you to Shane in this moment. And I think when he turns his head and makes eye contact with him, that is meant to be that moment that he's thinking this thought. And instead, he says, I will try. When Shane says, will you, and Ilya deflects to the humor again, that's him going back to a safe space. The emotions are getting really overwhelming, and so he makes a joke to go back into safety. We as viewers are then removed from the intimate moment that takes place on the couch between them. But in the book, there's this really important moment where Ilya cheats and speaks in Russian to Shane, and he says, I would stay here forever if I could. And Shane, he thinks maybe understood what he meant because some feelings can't be hidden behind foreign words. The show ends this moment by having another visual payoff of Ilya slapping Shane on the face, something that comes up again in this episode, but we've seen him do previously as well. And 3 minutes and 15 seconds later, we cut the scene and break. After the 3-minute, 15-second one-shot entry into the cottage, we have another uninterrupted minute and 45-second shot. And it also establishes that the point where the scene cuts is important because now we are cutting the scene when the act of intimacy itself begins. The show is now giving us the anticipation, but not the act itself, and keeping that intimacy between Shane and Ilya. In the book, Ilya is thinking that he can't believe what he'd been reduced to and how he was infatuated, and he notes that Shane looked so happy. Somehow, Ilya made him happy. Ilya wanted to always make him happy. For someone like Ilya who thinks of being attached to another human as painful or dangerous, using the word always and implying a future is a huge deal. But again, by the time we get to his confession of love in this episode, all of these moments where he thinks these things are adding up to this big culminating moment. When you know that he's thinking them in these story beats, it helps make sense of his behavior. In the book, there's actually a whole separate scene that takes place between the couch and when they go into Shane's bedroom. Shane has an indoor hockey training facility at the cottage, and the two of them are shooting pucks, and they actually talk about Scott Hunter. Ilya tells Shane that he was at the awards and listened to Scott Hunter's speech and also went out with him to a gay club afterwards. The show reuses this dialogue in the scene with Shane's parents at the dinner table, so those will get revisited. But within that scene, Ilya tells Shane that it made him jealous to see Scott kissing Kip on TV. And in that moment, Shane also almost says, "I love you" to Ilya by accident. I love how this is shot because we can tell that their bodies are moving out of frame, but we can't see anything but their shoulders and their heads and their facial expressions. But you have to imagine that they are holding on to one another very affectionately. Now that they're here together, they haven't separated. They're holding hands. Shane bumped into his own counter stools. He's going to bump into the railing as he walks up these stairs. The use of this shot of us standing behind Shane and Ilya as they go up these steps is also significant because it's a callback to the episode where we see them at Shane's apartment for the first time going up the stairs. Ilya had reached out to Shane's sweatshirt in that scene and wasn't able to grab it, and here they're both holding hands and Shane is leading him to his bedroom. I love that Ilya is looking around at the living room as they walk through here. Even though he's already seen this space, it's a different thing to see it in person. And they've already started this sort of role play type banter as they're walking into the room. Ilya's requests here for a king-size bed and an ensuite bathroom, they're very specific needs, but he's trying to say, "I'm not a guest here. I'm going to be staying with you." I love that he slaps Shane's butt here when he walks into the bedroom. And then we see him mirror Shane's actions here. So Shane puts his hands behind his back and Ilya mirrors him fully. In the books, his bedroom has a lot of mementos and personal things in it, and Ilya is so thrilled to be in there because he's never actually been in Shane's bedroom. In the show, they kind of make Shane's parents' house feel more like that, with all his childhood pictures and things there. They continue the bit well into this scene, and Shane kind of uses the humor as a safety net again. He typically tends to be very polite when nervous, and he's reaching for some sort of a framework to work within in this moment here. And Ilya teases him back the whole time. He's kind of letting Shane dictate how this is going to go until he pushes him back onto the bed. And that's when the "I'm just a bellboy, you can't treat the staff like this" flips the dynamic. And his line of, "Oh, I think I know how the staff likes to be treated after all of these years." It's a way to remind Shane he knows their shared history. He knows that this is familiar and they've been doing this for a very long time. And they're actually laughing now. And this is what allows Shane to kind of melt into the situation. He's not overthinking until he thinks of the blinds, which again is him wanting to have some sort of control and being so used to the framework that he's operated within for his whole life and worrying about him and Ilya being seen that he can't help but think of something that he can control to make it better. When I see Ilya's face on the bed like this, it reminds me of the earlier scenes when we saw him watching and observing Shane from a distance. I think there is a moment where he's worried that something is wrong, and then when he realizes that this is Shane just trying to be protective of the situation but keep it private, he's quick to say no. And it's not in a way that's angry or panicked. It's more just him confidently saying, "No, I'm choosing to be visible here with you. I'm not hiding here. I trust this place that we're in. Let's just enjoy it and not be so worried about everything." And Shane lets him. Then we get this mirroring of the first time that Ilya ever pushed Shane against the wall in that hotel room. And this time it is so much more playful. They know each other so much better. And their choreography mirrors that of the first hookup, but the context around it has changed completely. The first time they were walking through these motions, they were basically in the dark. Shane had never been with a man before, so he was nervous. Ilya was very much guiding things. In this scene, Shane is an active participant. They're in the daylight in one of their homes, and it's a little more urgent now, but not desperate. Before, Shane had said, "This is a bad idea," and now he's walking into it eyes wide open saying, "This is what I want. We can finally do this." The two of them being put in this environment where they know that they're not going to be seen, that they don't have the weight of their careers looming over them, that is the only reason that they're able to loosen up in the way that they are in this moment. And when those obstacles and building blocks are removed, just like at the All-Star game when they were on the same team and they're not pitted against each other as rivals, that tension all goes away and the fear goes away. And what's left is just their chemistry with one another and how much they enjoy one another as people, and ultimately how much they love one another. So when you have the choreography mirror the exact same moment as the very beginning of the show, it's meant to remind us of how far they've come. And then again, we are removed from the intimate moment. So we were able to be visible for the lead up, and then the show is now removing us from the actual act itself. Ilya has changed into a different outfit. And in the book, the scene where they make burgers is the following evening. Shane following a recipe to make burgers is such a Shane thing to do. But again, he's trying to eliminate the possibility of anything going sideways. And that's in part because they're so far removed from civilization out here in the cottage, but also because he needs to feel like he's control of how this 2 weeks is going to go. When Ilya says no, in the books he describes it as exhilarating to be outdoors like this and to be able to touch each other in the way they wanted to. It hadn't even been 2 days and he already had no idea how he was going to be able to get back to the real world. From here, the conversation between Shane and Ilya follows the text fairly closely, and Ilya revisits Shane's parents again. So he brought them up for the first time in the car when they were driving to the cottage, and in this scene he brings them up again because he's curious. He wants to know more about Shane's personal life. They've never had the opportunity to really talk about those things together. I love this shot of the table because it really kind of shows us that Shane is so particular and how perfect he wanted this meal to be for Ilya. And they start to talk about Shane's parents more candidly. And in the book, Ilya asks, "What's your mother's name?" In the show, he already knows Shane's mother's name. He's actually seen Shane's mother in the elevator when they first hooked up in episode 1. Him knowing both his parents' names also tells us as viewers how much he's dug into Shane on his own to get any sort of information about him that he can. And when Ilya says "and," it's his way of trying to have a more personal conversation with Shane, something again that they haven't really done. Ilya says, I don't know anything," when Shane asks, "What would you like to know?" And then he completely contradicts himself because he says, "I know your mother's half Japanese or something, and that your dad is boring," as a way to return back to a joke that they've shared between one another for years. We know that boring is a term of endearment for Ilya now, though. I think for Ilya, Shane's boring is where he finds his peace. So he means that as a compliment, but Ilya follows the bit in order to get any more information out of Shane about his parents. And it works because then Shane tells him where his father works and where he went to school and where he played hockey. So this is really just a masterclass that we're watching of Ilya figuring out how to get what he wants out of Shane. He knows that the only way Shane will share anything is if he eggs him on and irritates him in this way, playfully. When Ilya asks Shane, do they know? This is when the conversation starts to remind us as the viewers of what the biggest and deepest issue is with Shane and Ilya's relationship. Because Ilya's asking, do they know that you're gay? And Shane immediately assumes he is asking, do they know about him? And then Ilya has to correct him and say, no, I'm talking about, do they know about you? Ilya then asks, would they be good about it? And Shane walks through this sort of like panic and backpedals. I think they'd be fine with it. I don't know. I haven't really talked about it, which is such a Shane response because he kind of answers himself mid-sentence and then tries to neutralize the whole conversation. Because it's not that he thinks they'd react badly. It's more that he hasn't imagined how they're going to react because he hasn't thought he'd ever need to tell them. So when he admits, sometimes I think I would have told them already, it's revealing that the reason he hasn't is because of Ilya. He wants to tell his parents, but Ilya, being the man that he's in love with, has stopped him. And Ilya understands that immediately, so he says, oh, this is my fault, because he recognizes that Shane is going about this in a very different route than he would. And Shane's honest. He says, no, well, I mean, yeah, kind of. Because Shane doesn't know how to manage this situation, and Ilya recognizes that. So when he touches Shane's knee, he's trying to say, I'm not trying to pressure you. I'm just trying to have this conversation. And he has this really great line of trying to help Shane by saying, I think you can tell your parents you're gay without giving them a list of all the guys that you're sleeping with. It kind of takes the seriousness away, sure, but it also is reminding Shane that he's allowed to come out to his parents on his own terms. He doesn't have to tell them about Ilya, but he can't be blaming Ilya for not telling them, which is why it's so painful when Ilya is met with, no, I know, anyways, it doesn't really matter, because Ilya is basically telling Shane, I don't need to be introduced to them. I just want you to know that you can tell them if you'd like. And Shane's overwhelmed by that, so he deflects and gets up and takes Ilya's plate away. He wipes at his eyelash, which is an emotional tell that we've seen before. He goes into task mode to distract himself. He can't sit there and face Ilya and the weight of this conversation, so he has to get up and leave. So when Ilya's hand slides off his knee and he's left there, we see his emotional tell, which is him sniffling his nose, but Ilya doesn't push him. He, in the book, says he wanted to push him to say more, but instead he watched him walk away. And it still hurts him, but he's choosing to be patient instead of angry. They're in love, but they're still out of sync. And like with any relationship, they're trying to figure out how to avoid hurting one another as they navigate this really confusing path forward between them. After the conversation between Shane and Ilya about Shane telling the truth to his parents, there is actually a multi-paragraph long internal monologue about it, and how Shane is actually obsessed with the idea of Ilya meeting his parents. He'd imagined all the scenarios where he could have simply introduced them to Ilya without them knowing about their relationship, simply so that they could touch the hand of the man he loved. And because Shane loves Ilya, he wants them to love him too. Before their day ended and they sat around the fireplace, Shane had wondered if Ilya would be interested in living at the cottage when they retired, and then stops himself from getting consumed with thoughts of Ilya meeting his parents and spending summers with him and making a home with him. And in the book, the fire scene is actually in Ilya's point of view. And even though he could have thought of better things for them to do together that night, Shane had been so excited about the fire he didn't want to turn him down. There's this great quote that he finds it creepy to sit in a small pool of light in the middle of total darkness. To me, this scene acts as the first domino falling because everything that follows it happens pretty quickly. It's also the first scene in its entirety where we see Ilya making good on his promise to Shane to be honest while he's with him, because he's very honest here about his jealousy and then, as we know, about his mother. The only time we see Shane and Ilya get interrupted in this episode is when Shane's phone lights up. Ilya is not being contacted at all while he's here. So anytime Shane's attention is drawn away from him, he's hyper aware of it. And to see Shane's face light up like this and him to say, it's just Rose, we can see a flash of jealousy come over him right away. Ilya sort of dismissively acknowledges, just Rose. And his jealousy surfaces before he's able to kind of mask it like he normally does. And Shane keeps it very neutral by saying that she's just checking in. And this is the first time that they've ever had to address transparency between the two of them. Because as you know, Ilya had always had multiple partners. Now things are different, so this is them treading the water here. What's nice about this scene is it shows us that their relationship now feels safe enough for both of them to actually voice their feelings. And Ilya basically says, I want you to know I'm jealous, but I don't want to say that to you. And we get his tell here again with his nose. Shane reassures him by saying, Ilya, I'm gay, which basically means you don't need to be jealous. But Ilya's jealousy here runs deep because Shane chose Rose when he couldn't choose Ilya. He got to be with her in public, he got to be her boyfriend, go to clubs, dance in public, and we know from the books internally just how jealous Ilya was in that nightclub scene and throughout their relationship. He was constantly looking them up online. And so Shane's trying to neutralize this by telling him, it was a disaster both times. She's not looking for a repeat performance. And Ilya asks disasters like how. Shane sets a boundary here by saying he's not going to give him the details because he has nothing to be embarrassed or ashamed about, and he doesn't have to prove anything because he's told Ilya the truth. He's gay and Rose is not a threat to him. And it kind of reframes what jealousy in their relationship means now, because now it's allowed and they can talk about it and they can laugh about it and move past it. And that's a really key difference when you contrast it with how they handled things before. The loon moment is very iconic within the book canon. And when Shane laughs at Ilya in the book, Ilya says he wants to grab the embers from the fire and smash them into his own eyes because he could not bear to look at Shane's adorable, crinkled, happy face. Ilya was genuinely terrified in the books because he thought there was a pack of wolves coming around them. And again, if you're sitting in the middle of the darkness and not being able to see where they're coming from, I can understand that. One thing I've seen people say is that when Shane makes this loon call himself, it's actually one to ward off the other loons. So it's like a protective call that he puts out in order to protect Ilya. All I can picture is Shane being in the equivalent of the Boy Scouts and learning how to do this from a young age when he would spend his summers up here on the water. It's also a callback to when Ilya was in the hotel room watching Shane speak perfect French, and he was jealous of that. He brought up the French when he was on the phone with him in Russia and how he could learn Russian quickly because he's so good at speaking languages. And then of course now he happens to speak bird, which blows Ilya's mind. So when Ilya says I hate you, it's displacement of his feelings because he does not. Every time he looks at Shane in the scene, he can't deal with how much he loves him. And Shane says, no, you don't. Not teasingly, but certainly. And Ilya's face here is so perfect because he can't even look at him, and then he has to sneak a glance. And in the book, Ilya thinks, no, I don't. The scene where Ilya has his head in Shane's lap has a really great visual callback to his head in Svetlana's lap. And it's also the emotional turning point of the episode. Laying in a position like this is so vulnerable and it's very childlike, which makes sense for Ilya given the subject we're about to talk about and also what you know about him. In the book, Shane asks, have you talked to your family? And here he asks, have you talked to your brother? Which feels more personal because he knows what's going on and implies he's been listening. It also implies he's been holding on to this question, and Ilya knows that. I think Shane's really asking, are you still being hurt by people you feel responsible for at home? And he says too, even if they suck, you must miss them, because he's comparing them to his own family in the book. This is a more, I think, emotionally intelligent approach because it centers Ilya's grief without comparing it to Shane's family life and how much better it is. Ilya is being told, you're allowed to grieve the family that you now have lost and the people who have failed you. I love watching how Hudson navigated this scene because the way his face changes as Ilya's talking is really beautiful and brilliant. And I also like how we're kind of oscillating behind the fire so that the flames are dancing over Ilya's face. When Ilya says, my mother didn't suck, he regrets it instantly in the book because he knows what question will come next. And there's a long pause before Shane asks, how did she die? And internally, Ilya thinks it's been 14 years, but there's still a lump in his throat when he says, by accident, I found her. By accident, though, is the line he was trained to tell everyone from his father. But the I found her is the truth that he's never said out loud to anybody before. In the book, Ilya recalls that he had been told very sternly, even though he knew it wasn't true, that it was an accident at age 12. And his father had said, she'd had an accident, Ilya. You understand, yes? In the book, Shane actually pulls Ilya up to hug him standing, and I like here that they never move. Ilya says, I don't want you to think she was weak, because in his family, weakness is punished, and was very likely told that that's why his mother is gone. Shane immediately says, I don't, and that validates him. And Ilya continues saying, she was so funny and beautiful and so sad. And you can see Shane starting to move his hand and hold him in a different way to be more supportive in this moment for him. And I've seen a lot of people bring up that when he's talking about his mom, in many ways it's foreshadowing to what struggles he goes through in the long game. This is definitely a moment that will be made into a parallel in season 2, I have no doubt. In the book, they're standing and Ilya thinks to himself that he just wants to hold Shane close to him in this place where no one would find them. And that's when the loon call happens. And in that moment, Shane nearly says, "I love you" again, before the scene ends with them laughing. What I love about this change is that we get to live in this scene and in this moment longer. And even though Ilya laughs, Shane is not able to. And he touches Ilya's face and continues to run his fingers through his hair. And Ilya very much tucks himself back into Shane's lap and looks into the fire. And Shane asks him, "Do you want to go inside?" Even though Ilya is trying to use the humor as a reason to get out of that conversation, Shane leans into the grief. And we get this gorgeous close-up shot of Ilya's face in the fire, which is warped slightly from the heat of it. And he says simply, "No." And he doesn't hesitate or elaborate. And I love that we can see Shane's hands moving and rubbing him until they're able to link their fingers together here. Ilya saying no means, "I'm safe and I trust you with this. I trust you to comfort me through it." This is when they become each other's safe space, I think, which flows so perfectly into this scene where they wake up together, which is such a perfect scene because so much is said and there's maybe 4 lines of dialogue. The most obvious callback here is the tuna melt nap, where Ilya had so badly wanted closeness with Shane and spent the whole time watching him sleep instead of sleeping with him. Here, Ilya is deeply asleep and wakes up unguarded, and he wakes up to the light. There's no threat that wakes him up, jostling. His body is not in fight or flight at all. He is completely at ease. We see that with how he looks confused as he's waking up. In the book version, Shane is the one that watched Ilya sleep and had described a similar scene that they're reworking here as a perfect morning. The acting here is painfully simple. They aren't making any facial expressions really, but they're bathed in this beautiful orange glow in Shane's blue bedding. So again, the blue and the orange. And Ilya says, "I like you," in the most unfiltered way possible. I think this is a great callback to the line in the hotel at the All-Star game where Shane says, "I like you," and Ilya says, "You don't like me." This can be a moment of repair for that. It's also a callback to the "I hate you" from the night before at the fire pit. But it's also Ilya making good on his promise to Shane that he was going to be honest while here. And Shane says, "I like you too," without hesitation. In the book, this dialogue is moved around in different places. It's kind of stolen from 2 moments. But Shane describes it as not being an earth-shattering confession, but the words still moved him enormously. And this is our first shot of the water with the sun rising and this glistening glow, which sort of mirrors how the 2 of them are feeling because they're in love. And to me, I've always felt like liking your partner is the basis of being able to love them. Having a respect and an understanding and an acceptance of a partner is the foundation of loving them properly, and I think Shane and Ilya have that. After the "I like you" scene between Shane and Ilya, there's this really beautiful color transition that takes place, and the show had been using an orange and blue palette for most scenes at the beginning, but the colors were more harsh. Here we can see that the orange walls are really ambient, but the blue is much softer now, and it's seen in Ilya's shirt and Shane's sweatshirt and the blue of the sofa. To me, this is when the orange and blue are no longer kind of harsh oppositions of each other. It feels far more blended visually. The 2 of them sit down to play a video game together, and Shane is extremely childlike in this scene. His face is lit up, his knee is touching Ilya's. He's playing something very trivial, and where we normally see him so controlled, he is very open. He doesn't need to perform so much anymore. And Shane doesn't typically unwind like this. We see him reading a lot. It makes me question if he bought the game because Ilya is on the cover. And candidly, that does seem like something he might have done. Most of the dialogue is taken right out of the source material, but the addition of the Montreal and Yankees comparison is very much a tip-off to this being a Canadian show. And candidly, I wasn't sure if this scene was going to appear in this episode, but it's actually a really great choice to use it because it makes it very clear how their relationship has changed. Because typically when we see their intimacy, it's very high stakes, charged, emotional. And this is one of the first times we get to see it full of humor and playfulness. It becomes something that can be light and fun for them. When Hayden's phone call comes through, Ilya's jealousy returns. And I think it's important to note that Ilya doesn't have anybody calling him while he's at the cottage. All of the interruptions in the show are on Shane's phone. The line, "You're a baby," works on a few different levels because it teases Shane's softness with him, and it's a way for Shane to show him he likes this version of him. This scene is also important because we are reminding everyone of Hayden, who will be very important in season 2, and Ilya and Hayden are very much at odds with each other most of the time. There's a long-standing joke that the two of them do not like each other. So this scene is simply Ilya being a pest. And we've seen glimpses of Ilya being like this in his own locker room with his team, but Shane wasn't present for those scenes. So this is the first time really that we're seeing him be like this with Shane. It's also a great scene to showcase how Shane and Ilya are getting better at reading one another, knowing their limits, their likes, their dislikes, where the boundary is, how to push it. I think Connor's story was given a lot of bandwidth here to really bring some humor into the scene, and he took full advantage and ran with it because I was cracking up laughing watching this moment. And Hudson does a great job of walking that line where Shane is fighting an internal battle here the entire time on the phone. Over the course of their relationship, Ilya has definitely learned that Shane invites the feeling of losing control. He often needs Ilya to push him a little further in order for him to accept his invitation to meet him there. And again, this is a great scene to remind us of that dynamic between the two of them, but how it looks now that there is, again, that humor and playfulness in their dynamic, which was not there before. When you compare this to episode 2 in the Vegas hotel room scene, it's like two completely different people are in the room with us, especially Ilya, because he was actively restraining himself, keeping himself emotionally covered in armor and terrified of what touching Shane would mean. Here, he is being incredibly impulsive. He's super transparent with his emotions. The man is puppy-eyed, affectionate, very obvious about what he wants. Their dynamic has shifted. They no longer need intensity for their interactions to be meaningful. They can just have humor and fun and laughter, and the entire way that this scene is shot is proof of that. What made this scene even funnier for me is that there just simply is no way that Hayden would not know that something was going on with Shane. He is audibly out of breath by the time he unmutes the phone. And what I love about this moment, again, is that because we're shooting in this aspect ratio, we don't see a lot of movement outside of the frame. So we can see that Shane puts his leg on Ilya's chest, and then we can see Ilya's hand moving. So you have to infer that he is grabbing on to Shane's foot here. And then again, because we've had more quiet moments between the two of them, we've seen Ilya grab Shane's knee already before. He does it in episode 5, and he rubs his knee in a way that's familiar to us already. So again, it's showing us that this is a learned behavior that he is now implementing regularly. But my favorite beat of this entire moment is the end, when Shane hangs up the phone and climbs into Ilya's lap, a position we've seen him in many times before, and tells him, "Why was that so hot?" And he says, "Because you like to be bad." And Ilya basically spaces out looking into Shane's eyes here, but in the book, he describes saying those exact words twisted something inside him. He was just teasing Shane, but he wondered how true those words were. Was that, perhaps, all this was to Shane? Rebellion? Was that all he was to Shane? Shane notices that in the book and kisses his palm and then delivers the line from the show. But in the book, Ilya wants to ask Shane, "Why do you do it now?" But he was scared of the answer, and so he kissed him instead and asked, "How's Hayden?" I like the show version too because it's more playful. I think we hold this gaze a lot longer, which is really beautiful. And I've said before that whenever these two make bets or dares or have competition, it's sexual. But then whenever they're making plans, it's serious. And this next scene, Ilya has been formulating a plan. I love this shot through the living room window because you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of this middle window, there are two loons standing together, representative of the two loons that are out in the yard playing soccer. And in the show, we hear Ilya starting to voice things to Shane that he's been thinking about. In the book, he says he can't see a realistic scenario where he and Shane are anything more than what they were now, and he wasn't even sure what he wanted them to be. But when he let his imagination run wild, he would think of them together as a couple, living together, getting married potentially. In the book, Ilya's sitting in an Adirondack chair when he's thinking about this, spacing off, and Shane catches him. Here I like that, again, it's framed around them being competitive. Ilya says that he would very much like to not have a Russian passport and that he's been contemplating Canadian teams in free agency. In the book, he knows that Shane is thinking about him playing in Montreal, so he quickly says not Montreal. But he can't help but imagine what it would be like if they were playing together, living together, being together, and then he knows it's not going to happen. But it was a nice thought for him to have. This is when Ilya really starts trying to come up with a solution to fix this problem between them. And it takes Shane a while, but eventually he gets there, and we see that in the beautiful scene that takes place after this one. In the book, Shane and Ilya are playing pool in Shane's basement while having this conversation, and I much prefer the show having them sit on the couch here. They're sitting in silence, they don't need to fill the space with conversation, and it's such a great example of modern intimacy with them scrolling on their phones. Ilya is in Shane's clothes on his couch, just like Shane had been dressed in Ilya's clothes on his couch. And where before they'd sat apart on the couch during the day, Shane on the right and Ilya on the left, now it's nighttime, Shane's on the left and Ilya's on the right. The positions are reversed, the clothes are reversed, and so is the distance between them. Because it's taking place at night, we have lots of moody, warm orange lighting. Shane has his socks on, and Ilya touches his nose before the conversation even starts, which is his tell that he's thinking about something. Ilya's also typing on the phone before we cut up to them and close to their faces, and we see Ilya speak before cutting to Shane. Shane already looks focused, but as soon as Ilya says, "I could marry Svetlana," his emotions are written across his face clear as day. And he lifts his eyes in total disbelief of what he's hearing, half expecting it to be a joke. But then he realizes Ilya is serious, and Ilya keeps talking and says she's American, would be easy citizenship. This is when Shane hardens his expression even further, and he takes a deep breath and holds it for the rest of this conversation. In the book, he describes this as Ilya casually dropping the worst nightmare on him, which is in contrast to Ilya, who looks casual on his phone, insisting she would do it. Her father is goalie Sergei Vitrov. And Shane cuts him off, "Yeah, you told me." Ilya is thinking several steps ahead here already, and he's trying to get Shane to catch up. And he's doing this in a very calculated way. So when he is typing on his phone, not making eye contact, and we cut back to Shane, and he sings songs, "She Would Help Me," Shane's expression hardens even more. Ilya knows that the only way to get Shane to reveal his feelings is to push a button or pull a lever, and in this situation, it's jealousy. He already tried to get Shane to bite during the tuna melt scene by bringing up Svetlana and girls. He also knows that anger is the only button to press with Shane that cracks him wide open. Ilya doesn't know how to just say, "I need to figure out how I can be a citizen, so if we're together, I'm not afraid of being sent home to Russia." For Ilya, he's trying to build a future where he can stay here with Shane without fear. When he's waiting for Ilya to elaborate, his eyes snap away while he collects himself and waits for the next part. And in the book, he says that it had been eating away at him for so long before he asks, "But is she, I don't know, someone you'd want to marry?" which is slightly different dialogue than in the book. And Ilya still is not looking at him when he says, "We are friends, we would be fine." So he's trying to say to Shane, it wouldn't be for love. We're only friends. I would be doing this for you. But Shane hears the words married and friends and passport and thinks that this is Ilya choosing someone else who isn't him for convenience and not for love. And all he hears is that he is replaceable. Ilya only looks at Shane when he's done saying that, and he's still holding his phone, so he's half distracted, and Shane is beyond pissed. He can't even look at him. So Ilya explains further, and it wouldn't be for the passport, because he's trying to say to Shane, "I'm doing this for us," but Shane doesn't hear that because he's too literal. So he nods ironically and collects himself again and says, "Okay, but..." And Ilya presses him because he wants Shane to be honest. He wants to get closer to Shane saying he loves him, so Ilya can say it back. So when Shane looks down to collect himself again, he says, "But you like women, right?" And he shrugs as though it's the most obvious issue here, because it's possible for Ilya to get married and have kids with a woman because he categorically likes women, and for Shane, that's not an option. And he continues by saying you could find someone you'd... And then he has to take a another breath to say, want to marry for real. And then he nods and says, and still get the passport. So him shaking his head here and averting his eyes, it's as if to say, make it make sense to me. Why Svetlana? At that, Ilya finally puts his phone down and pays attention to Shane, but he still isn't looking at him, and he's playing it casual when he says maybe, but, because he's baiting Shane to lead him into what he wants to say. And it works, because Shane asks, but what? And Ilya shrugs and says, I have this problem, which for Ilya is framing this as something abstract, meaning the logistics of getting a passport, marriage. But for Shane, hearing the word problem would be a trigger, and his body reacts before his mind does here, because this word has already been poisoned for him when Rose used it to categorize their relationship as unfixable. She had said a problem is something you can fix, and she and Shane couldn't fix their problem. So when Ilya uses the same word, Shane hears that suggestion that whatever it is between them might be broken beyond repair. So Shane's being very brave here when he asks what's the problem. He's walking straight into this conversation that could threaten to absolutely destroy him. And this dialogue is added because he doesn't ask what the problem is in the book. When Ilya sits up on the couch and leans forward closer to Shane, he has this very aloof reaction when he says, I like women, yes. And he's pressing on the most obvious truth here because he wants to see what it does to Shane's face. And Shane says, yeah, I know, and clenches his jaw. And then we hold the camera on Shane's face so we can see exactly what Ilya is seeing as he says these lines. And he's saying them because he wants Shane to reveal how he feels about him. And Ilya's dying to know how Shane feels. And when he keeps going, it's because he's searching. So he says, and everywhere I go, I'm surrounded by beautiful women and they love me. And as soon as the word love comes into it, Shane has to look away. And it's a knee-jerk reaction. So he says, sounds rough, and swallows, and he still can't look at Ilya. So now Ilya knows that it hurts Shane to think of women loving him. It upsets him. And he says, yes, it is, with no sarcasm, because being wanted by everyone but the person Ilya wants is exhausting and has been painful for him. And he says, listen, which is him asking Shane to listen to his completed thought before he retreats into protecting himself. And he still won't look at Ilya while Ilya continues saying, and these women, they're so sexy and fun. And sexy is the word that makes Shane look at him again, because he's shocked that Ilya is continuing to talk like this to him. And that's when the camera cuts back to Ilya and his gaze moves off of Shane as he says, but I'm always thinking about this slow fucking hockey player. And his eyes move back to Shane when he says, with beautiful freckles, because Ilya wants there to be no mistake here. He is always thinking about Shane. He thinks Shane's freckles are beautiful. And he lets out a breath because this is as close to I love you as Ilya has ever come. He's named the problem, which is that no matter how many people want him, he's always thinking about and wanting Shane, which is huge because for Shane, he thinks Ilya can marry a woman. He can love a woman. He could follow through with this plan if he wanted to. In Shane's mind, Ilya liking women is the problem. So now Ilya is making it clear to Shane that that's not the problem at all. What I love about the way this scene is shot is that a lot of times we have Ilya talking and then we're looking at Shane's face. So we're actually able to see what Ilya sees when he's trying to get a rise out of him. And here, Ilya wants more emotion because Shane smiles and then holds it back. So he throws another jab at Shane and says, and a weak backhand, as a mock insult. And Shane once again takes the bait and questions a weak backhand. And Ilya says, yes, very weak, because it gets Shane to smile again, as intended. And again, Ilya wants more, so he continues, and he's so boring, and he drives this terrible car, and falls back onto the couch and mock offense over his car. And Shane defends himself with, it's a normal car, which is a callback to the top of the episode. But this is when Ilya closes the distance between a joke and the truth, when he says, I am always wishing that these women were him. And he says it like it's the simplest thing in the world, and that is what undoes Shane. In the book, Shane thinks that he is about to start crying as soon as Ilya says those words, and Ilya asks him, in the show, it's a terrible problem, huh? And it makes it clear to Shane that he was being sarcastic before, but now he's got the context, and Shane still needs clarity, so he steadies himself and swallows and asks, do you want that problem to go away? Because in his heart, he still has not heard Ilya come right out and say that his feelings for Shane are not a problem. And he's offering Ilya a chance to walk away if that's what he wants. And Ilya's serious now when he nods his head no, and he looks right at Shane and he says, I don't ever want that problem to ever go away. And the use of the word ever twice here is really significant change from the book because it removes every possible loophole for Shane's brain. It's making it impossible for Shane to misunderstand the subtext of what Ilya is saying here. And I think Ilya does that on purpose. He wants to ease his mind. When we look at Shane and he smiles again, he confidently says, don't marry Svetlana. And then he swallows and says, just don't. And then he swallows again. And by the time we cut to Ilya's face, listening to Shane admit what he's been dying to hear, which is that he does not want Ilya to be with somebody else, you can feel the oxygen has been kind of sucked out of the room. And Shane says, I know it wouldn't be for love or whatever, just don't. And this is him removing the logistics, the passport issue completely, because none of that matters to him more than telling Ilya not to choose someone else. And when we cut back to Shane's face here and he has tears welling up in his eyes, we know that this is what Ilya had just watched Shane's face turn into as he said those words to him, which is what Ilya wanted all along. When Shane concludes, we can figure something else out, okay? The way his voice nearly breaks when he says okay broke me, because for once he's not proposing a solution. He's just stating a fact that they want to be together. Whatever comes next, they can figure out together, and he uses the word we to express that. Then Ilya whispers okay back, which we've heard him whisper a bunch of times in the show, specifically the first time they met outside the rink. And we sit in that silence for a beat before we cut back to the wide shot here of their feet touching in the center of the couch. And we collectively remember that Ilya made sure he was touching Shane throughout that entire conversation. And when the conversation ends, he was pressing his toes into Shane's feet encouragingly, as if to say, we understand one another then, yes? And Shane nods because he does, and that seals it. And this conversation is what gives Shane the opportunity and the urgency to try and solve the problem, because there is a future here worth fighting for. And like his mom, Yuna, he is going to find a solution, even if that means staying up all night trying to figure out what that is. In the wake of the I have this problem scene, Shane is sitting up in the dark thinking about how he can solve the problem of Shane and Ilya wanting to be together. And in the book, there are multiple scenes spaced out over multiple days where Shane and Ilya are actively working through the plan together. In the show, it's implied that Shane is up that same night as the conversation thinking of a plan. In the books, the morning after that conversation, Ilya suggests that he could play for a team in the West to try and make the rivalry not such a big deal. Shane points out, though, that if they did that, they'd only play each other twice a year, aka would only see each other twice a year, and Ilya describes that as a sacrifice for a future gain. And when Shane asks future gain, Ilya says, yes, our rivalry has been huge, but maybe we can help it to fade away a little. That comment of Ilya's is what got Shane excited, thinking about the possibility of one day. And in the show, they make this conversation take place the same night, which implies an immediacy that Shane feels over solving their problem as quickly as possible. So when he wakes Ilya up in the middle of the night, and he does so touching his curls, it's important to remember that Ilya believes love is sacrifice. He's willing to do the hard thing despite the emotional cost to himself. And he calls that sacrifice necessary for future gain because he's thinking in longer arcs. To Shane, love immediately translates to logistics. So once Ilya says he never wants the problem to go away, Shane can't sleep until he turns that into something survivable for them both. He makes the problem actionable. Their rivalry fading away is the only way they can find that freedom. And Ilya has been the one offering up solutions thus far. Now Shane can lead. When Shane starts to divulge this Ottawa plan, what's crucial here to remember is that objectively speaking, Shane doesn't need to do any of this. They played well together at the All-Star game, and there's already a very simple explanation that they could arrive to for their rivalry fading. They could have become friends on that weekend, they could have stayed in touch afterwards, or they could just not explain anything at all because players are friendly across teams all the time, and they could stop giving sound bites in interviews that feed into the rivalry. They could exist in proximity to one another without people reading into it if they wanted to, and they could occasionally be seen together and let ambiguity do the work. But Shane can't live in that gray area. He needs to control the narrative in order to feel safe. It's no different than him buying all the groceries, telling his parents he's on a silent retreat, making 8 burgers on the grill. Shane doesn't trust that things can simply be fine unless he has personally accounted for every variable. He needs the optics to make sense, because if they don't, then his anxiety fills all of those gaps with the worst case scenario. Which is why this Ottawa plan is so detailed, and it's not because the rest of the world needs it to be that detailed, it's because Shane does. If people were to see them together, Shane wants there to be a plausible reason. And if there is a reason, it needs to be one that makes sense to him. If he can control this situation, just like he's trying to control everything at the cottage, then Ilya can't be taken away from him. That's where this kind of over-engineered explanation of starting a charity with a PR arc that makes sense for them becoming friends, it's a way for him to preempt every question before it can even be asked. And this is where the contrast between him and Ilya becomes especially clear, because Ilya is willing to let things be messy, and he's already been living in that subtext, whereas Shane does not. He needs structure, he needs rules, he needs a story that makes sense to him. And him thinking of every possible outcome, it's because he's been given something so unbelievably precious to him in knowing that Ilya wants to be with him. It's also why this moment matters so much before we hear Ilya say, "I love you," because Shane is behaving like someone in love. He's planning years ahead, trying to minimize risk and any sort of threat to their relationship. He's trying to make their situation as stable as possible so that long term they work and they can keep it private so that their profession can't ruin their relationship. Shane wanting to change the narrative is basically him saying, if I can make this make sense to everybody else, then maybe I won't lose you. On the surface level, the easiest issue for them to tackle is the proximity issue, and Ottawa has an opening on their team, and it's 2 hours away from Montreal. So that is a big hurdle that they're able to get over if Ilya were to play for Ottawa. What we learn in the long game, though, is that playing for Ottawa comes with a lot of implications for Ilya, because it's a huge step down from being the captain of Boston. But again, we know that Ilya is willing to make those sacrifices for future gains. When Shane suggests they start the charity together, something that benefits both cities, and he approached Ilya with this idea, and Ilya interjects with, "Or I approached you," I love that because it brings back in their competitiveness. And when Ilya brings in the joke, any questions, it's him naming the truth in a way that makes it safe for them both to laugh at it. But Shane is dead serious about this. This is like a life or death situation for him. So he wants Ilya to be serious and take him seriously. In the book, it says he wanted Ilya to see this vision as clearly as he could. It seemed tantalizingly possible, easy even. And at the end of the conversation in the book, Shane brings up, you'd be in Canada and you could apply for citizenship eventually. And Ilya says, yes, I understand that part. This is when Shane says, and maybe someday when we both retire, we can be together for real, which is the bravest thing Shane has said so far, because he's naming the choice in front of them, which is to be together for real, choosing to do the hard thing now so that they can have that someday. And Ilya is stunned by that, because for Ilya, he's never let himself think that far ahead, and every time he has, he's made himself stop because it's too painful. And in those words, Shane has just made their future feel real for the first time, which is why he says, you really think that far ahead, Hollander. I really love the way that this shot is composed, because we're looking at Ilya only while Shane is talking, and only half of his face, which is a callback to the shot used in the all-star hotel room scene. And I love that in this shot you can in real time see Ilya's wheels spinning as he internalizes all of the emotional labor that Shane is presenting to him, because Shane isn't just imagining a future, he's actively building one with this plan. And it's an incredibly detailed plan because he loves Ilya that much, and no one in Ilya's life has done that for him, not since his mother. And for Shane to say, I do, and validate that question, but then also say about this and clarify that it's only about his future with Ilya, that he thinks that far ahead, all of those things compound. And Ilya now is able to be more forward and specific with his questions. So he says, you want that, to be together. He needs to know definitively that that's what Shane wants. And again, just like in the all-star hotel scene, we are watching one side of Ilya's face reacting to Shane saying, I do, so much it terrifies me, which is really Shane saying, I'm choosing you, I'm planning around you, I'm afraid, but I'm doing it anyway. And that makes the payoff of Ilya turning away from Shane and revealing another tear that had fallen down on his cheek that much more palpable, because we've seen him do this before. We've seen him cope with big emotions like this before. We know what's coming after this. And I like that the show added Shane's little hey here, which we also saw him do in the Vegas hotel scene. We also saw him do that in the hospital when he was drugged up, and now again here. Here, it seems more like he's concerned for Ilya since he's crying and he's not so focused on himself, which I liked. In the books, it says Ilya turned back and quickly rolled on top of Shane and was kissing him and kissing him. And I like that we see him kissing him in places that he always tends to touch, like on Shane's neck. And he kept murmuring the same thing in Russian over and over again. And in this scene, we see Shane getting wrapped up in his voice again like he did in the stairwell with his eyes closed, until Ilya pulls back and they touch foreheads again, which is another great visual parallel. And Ilya translates, I love you, in a really broken, croaky voice because his emotions are completely bubbling over in a rush. And the lighting of this scene is so beautiful. And when they both freeze and Shane says, holy shit, in the books it says it wasn't how he meant to respond. And Ilya says, I mean, and his eyes are so scared. He does sniffle, which again is an emotional tell with his nose, and he's afraid he said too much or the wrong thing because it's a callback to the tuna melt scene when he said Shane and Shane panicked. He's trying to unwind the moment in case it scares Shane away, but Shane says, I love you too, and he doesn't run away, and he doesn't look away, and he reassures Ilya, and Ilya gives a shaky exhale before he collapses onto Shane's chest and says, fuck Hollander. This release is years of Ilya's agony pouring into Shane because we know from Rachel Reed's passage about Vegas, Ilya had a panic attack in the bathroom before the award show and spent that night going out of his way not to kiss Shane because he knew that he would have fallen apart and not been able to stop kissing him. He wouldn't have been able to resist wanting to fall asleep with him and cuddle and spend the whole next day in bed and let himself fall apart with him. So that build up from all of these micro moments where he wanted to do that and denied himself, not only the act of it, but the hope of one day being able to do that with Shane is like a dam breaking. He finally gets to say and do all of these things that he has denied himself for years. And when he collapses onto Shane, he finally lets himself fall apart in his arms for the first time. Shane saying, oh my God, I love you so much. You see he has a tear that's just bubbled over on his eye, and he asks Ilya, does it fucking kill you too? Which is changed from the book where the line is, does it feel like agony for you too? And this change is subtle, but in the book, Shane's almost asking to compare their relative pain because agony is so internal. It's something that you carry around and you don't complain about. And the show version is more of a request for honesty. He needs to know. This forehead kiss is a callback to the first time that Shane does this in episode 2, and where in the first time Ilya was afraid of the intimacy and left, now he's collapsing into it. And when he says not anymore, these two words reframe Ilya's entire emotional arc because for him, loving Shane was never the part that hurt him. The part that hurt him was the uncertainty and the fear of never getting to have a future. That's the part that killed him. For Ilya, he would have believed it may have been impossible that anyone could love him. That notion likely died with his mother. If you think back to the hotel scene at the All-Star weekend, Ilya saying, you don't like me, and nearly saying, I'm not worth it. The word agony kind of encapsulates all of the internal monologues that you read in the book that imply Ilya's in agony. The removal of it in the show is probably my one small tidbit that I wish they would have kept. In the books, this is the moment that the point of view switches to Ilya, and he felt like his smile was going to split his face because he was so overwhelmingly happy. And the passage reads, Ilya loved him and Shane loved him. Holy fucking shit. Shane Hollander is in love with me. There's also a passage of Ilya wasn't sure his heart could take any more of this. It felt like it was pushing up against his lungs, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to do anything except hold Shane down and kiss him over and over again. I love that in the show version, Ilya just collapses and fully enmeshes himself with Shane here, because this is exactly what he's longed to do for years. He just lets himself fall apart in Shane's arms and be held by him. And this emotional dam breaking flows into the next scene. After Shane and Ilya say I love you, the show provides this incredible montage between the two of them, which is almost exclusively visual callbacks for the viewer. This sunrise shot is a parallel to the scene of the two of them on the beach in episode 5, except this time they're tucked up against one another, beneath a blanket, which is meant to signal that this is the high point of their story, because we started with them far apart with a visual distance between them, first in the shower, then in the Vegas hotel room, on the sofa, and slowly over the course of the series, they have started to close that gap. So with the hotel hug, the handhold on the beach, with their toes touching, and now here they are finally together side by side, because the emotional distance gap has been closed. Sunrises are so symbolic of turning a page and a new chapter for them both, and this song that plays over this scene is my favorite detail of this entire sequence, because we first hear the notes of this song play at the end of episode 1 when they're on the roof in Vegas. It's under a much more synthy techno beat, and then the second time we hear these notes is the moment immediately following Ilya's Russian monologue scene in episode 5 after he admits that he's in love with Shane. Here, we finally get to hear the song in its entirety, and it's so sweeping and beautiful and optimistic, and it carries the moment from this sunrise into the moments that follow. There's lots of talk of why Ilya would be smoking here, and I know people are confused as to why he would be, given that Shane doesn't like it, but it's important to recontextualize the first shot, because he's alone outside looking at the sun and smoking. Then Shane walks into the frame and joins him, which means Ilya had been outside alone thinking before Shane joins him in his thoughts. This whole sequence of this sunrise is a show-only edition, and it serves a few purposes, because we are able to let the I love you moment between them land, and we sit with it for a lot longer. And then we get to watch the two of them privately deal with that during this sunrise shot. We don't see their faces. We are set back a distance from them while they sit on this rock, and it's a private moment that we are just peeking in on. When Ilya is sitting alone here, I have to imagine that he is so overwhelmed with his feelings about what just happened and what's going on in his life that he needed a cigarette. He told Shane his greatest secret, and Shane loves him back, which means that he's going to now make Shane his priority. They're going to have Ilya move to Canada. They're going to start a charity. He's going to play for Ottawa, and they're going to actually push forward towards being together, which means that Ilya is sacrificing Russia. He is not planning to go back now, officially. He is planning to become a citizen of another country for Shane. His whole life is about to be completely upended. But again, he views love as sacrifice, necessary sacrifice for a future gain. But he has so much processing to do internally, and so yes, he tries to drop the habit of smoking because Shane doesn't like it. But I also think this scene works in two ways, because it also shows that Shane is now more accepting of what Ilya needs in order to process his emotions. Before, even though Ilya needed the cigarette to cope, Shane would make his own personal association with smoking front of mind. Now, he joins Ilya there on the rock and brings him other things to help him cope, like a blanket and a cup of tea or coffee, a hug, his presence, just to reassure and support him. And Shane doesn't want to change any of Ilya's behaviors, because now he understands him and wants to find ways to support him better. A relationship requires acceptance of the other person and also compromise. And with this one small detail of having Ilya smoking, they convey that to us without dialogue. The show also rearranges a few scenes here. So in the book, after they say I love you, we immediately go into the very palpably intimate scene that follows this one. And in the aftermath of that moment, Shane asks Ilya what his mother's name was. They move that around here, but there are times in the long game where Ilya reflects that he's thinking about his mother, and I like to imagine he was thinking about her then too. These shots of the sun and the glistening on the water, those are all meant to be visual callbacks to how Scott Hunter's storyline said that they deserve sunshine. So this is all the examples of how Shane and Ilya are able to have sunshine in their own relationship too. In the intimate scene afterwards, the lighting here is so soft and the focus is going in and out, which makes us feel the same sort of blissful, floating dreamlike feeling that Ilya and Shane are experiencing together. And again, this montage is all about visual callbacks, so the position they're in is a mirror to the one we saw them in episode 2 after they first had sex, and the choreography is very much the same. One of the most interesting pieces of this scene, though, is the dialogue changes from the books. They had wanted to be as close as possible to each other in this moment in the books, and there's far more urgency and some banter here. In the show, we're focusing on emotions only, and the dialogue is actually flipped. The show flipping that narrative makes Shane the one overwhelmed by the reality of the situation, and Ilya is now the one who normalizes and grounds the situation. I think this was done because when Ilya says, "I love you," they fell into the roles in the book where Shane is the one studying Ilya, and I think they wanted to make it feel even here because there's a beat in between with the sunrise scene. Shane asking how could we let this happen also frames his headspace of worrying about their careers and reputations and the public scrutiny, and we know Ilya is less concerned about that. He reframes it as them being stupid and irresponsible to diffuse Shane's overwhelm, and Shane is catching up to the weight of what just happened, whereas Ilya has been living with it for a lot longer than Shane has and accepted it long ago. The show also makes Shane be vulnerable here by having him ask, "This is real though, right?" Because he's doubting his own reality, and Ilya only nods here and holds eye contact, and their intimate moment is more of the confirmation. In the book, Ilya says, "I feel like I am dreaming," and I do wish we had Ilya say that out loud, but his facial expressions convey this dreamlike euphoria that he's experiencing here even more. I have never seen someone convey this so well on screen. It's like an intrusion. And again, the show maintains the norm of removing us as viewers from the climactic moment of the intimacy between them, but before we get more visual callbacks with the choreography. Shane's thumb, his hands in Ilya's hair, all those tiny details we've collected in our minds, and we can see again in this scene, but with the added weight of them being openly in love while having sex here and knowing how different it must feel for them. The moment that follows when the song ends is one of my favorite shots of the entire show because we just saw Ilya's face in the most intense, raw expression, and then we cut instantly to only Ilya's face, and he looks so young again. For the second time, we are seeing Ilya processing the gravity of everything that has just transpired, and I love the way the sunlight is slicing across his forehead. In the book, both of them are deliriously happy, quiet, and sleepy when Shane asks, "What was your mother's name?" And in the book, his fingers are tracing Ilya's necklace. We can't see that here because of the aspect ratio, but I like to imagine that that's what he's doing. And in the book, Ilya had already told him that this necklace belonged to her. Shane already knows that. When Ilya says Irina, he has a very small, subtle smile on his face, and in the book he reflects that he hadn't said her name in so long that it felt strange in his mouth. And then he asks Shane, why? Shane then shares his idea for the hockey school and the charity and what the money would go towards, and in the book he is slightly embarrassed by it. And Ilya forces his face back up to him and thinks to himself that he has to try not to cry in this moment. And in the books, he says she would have loved that idea. Then Ilya has a very hard time finding the words in English to express what it means to him that Shane thought of this idea. He couldn't find the right way to label his feeling, and because of that, he said, "She would have loved you." The show then adds, "Like I love you," which I think is beyond brilliant because it's so simple and riveting and loaded because Ilya's mother represents the only love he has ever known until Shane. She loved him without him needing to be anything but himself. Telling Shane that the most important person in Ilya's life would have loved him is a huge admission. The phrase, "like I love you," is different than just saying "I love you" because it places Shane on equal footing with the person who taught Ilya what love even is. and also lets Shane into his grief, because up until now, Ilya has only ever been able to grieve her alone. Shane wanting to honor her in this way is so significant to Ilya, and his love for Shane is measured against the deepest love that he's ever known in his entire life. Ilya looking at Shane here, there would have been this golden light filtering in all around behind Shane's head, and it's just such a beautiful visual. When Shane says, "Say it again in Russian, please," in the books, he tries to actually repeat it back to Ilya in Russian, and it's such a intimate bid for connection because it comes on the heels of talking about Ilya's mother. No doubt Ilya had been thinking about home before this moment, especially if Shane had been touching his necklace. And it's also Shane wanting Ilya to say it in the way that is most himself. And Ilya points like Shane had done in the I love you scene. Little details like this, I think, hit harder because of the aspect ratio choices here, because we, again, don't get to see all of the physicality happening off screen. And so your brain is trying to figure out, how are they laying? What is the orientation here? And then we just get the tiniest little shot of Ilya's hand coming up to point at himself here when he says I, and then pointing to Shane when he says you, and then he says the word love last, because Russian, the words are in a different order. It makes the intention behind each word a physical action and very intentional. When Shane kisses Ilya's chin, Ilya actually did this in the hotel, the second scene that they were together, and it's such a gentle, simple, grounding way to punctuate the moment. Ilya then tucking Shane's head under his chin is a callback to when he did that on the couch during the tuna melt scene. And it's very much a position of trust. And the way the scene ends feels so settled and effortless. And I love that Shane's hands are on Ilya's head as well, one in his hair and one under his jaw, which again, because of the aspect ratio, we only get to see a little sliver of Shane's thumb here. Then we jump into the next day, presumably, in one of the most domestic scenes between these two. I found it interesting because it's shot in this very desaturated, overexposed coloring, almost like the brightness is all the way on. In the books, Shane actually has a dock and a boathouse, but here they're just in the water, and I do kind of like that Shane's house is a little more pared back. He sits on a rock watching Ilya goof off in the water, and I liked that we got to see Connor's gymnastics background at work here. In the book, Ilya sees Shane standing on the dock and pushes him into the water, and that's when Shane brings up that his phone could have been in his pocket. The book also has a few moments prior to that where his phone has been ringing, so we get that verbal line here to tell us that his phone had been ringing all day instead, which is foreshadowing to Shane's dad trying to call him. This scene is also another callback to Ilya watching Shane's TV special on his cottage, which he already mentioned when he first arrived at the top of the episode, when he told Shane that he had already known that he had his house built and he didn't purchase it. He brings up, is this where you do yoga or up there? And in the books, he means on the dock. Shane starts to answer honestly and says, no, I do it inside. The producer wanted me. And that's when he realizes that Ilya must have watched the TV special. So he pivots and says, wait, you saw that? And I loved that his voice cracks almost excitedly and very childlike. Ilya says, yes, it was very good. I needed help sleeping, so... And it's hilarious because we as the viewer saw how he was sitting alone in his living room, dialed all the way in, watching Shane do yoga in his yard. So that's a great comedic beat. And then Shane says, you're an asshole. But now we know that that's affectionate, and it's another callback to him calling him an asshole in episode 1. Ilya asking how's the water is a way for them to fit in the splashing Shane moment and the phone in the pocket moment. And I love that moment because it's so classically showing a type A person and their partner whose sole goal in life is to get them to loosen up. And Shane repeatedly saying, you're still an asshole, is now definitely translated into, I still love you though. It's also another callback to the Shane Hollander is an asshole moment in episode 5. But truly the highlight of this entire scene, and maybe of the entire episode, is Ilya kissing Shane's shin here, which to me is almost like a, I worship you, I kiss the ground you walk on. And then he is so unabashedly candid when he says, not asks, says, gimme kiss, with his hands on Shane's thighs. And it's just a perfect way to capture how once Ilya is allowed to freely kiss Shane and touch him and love him so openly, he has these waves where he's just overwhelmed with the need to kiss him. And he takes these moments now. He has this huge smile on his face, his nose is crinkled up, and it's just a peck. Like, it's the purest form of affection that we've ever seen between them, because it's not meant to escalate beyond this. Shane's playful "you're cold." It's almost like he's trying but failing to pretend like he doesn't absolutely love Ilya behaving this way. It's like he defaults into facts because he's overwhelmed by how much he loves Ilya. Camera work in the scene after Shane and Ilya leave the water is some of my favorite of this episode. We listen to Shane and Ilya talk about having pasta from last night or hot dogs for dinner. And I love that it implies that they've been doing so many small, mundane couple things that we have not been shown. It puts the idea in our head of them cooking dinners together, sitting down at the table and eating together, and we can sort of fill that imagery in on our own with our imagination. This kiss plays out differently in the show than it does in the books, but it's such a fascinating thing to think about. If Ilya didn't turn Shane around and kiss him in this moment, they could have potentially played out David seeing them in a very different way. Here, the camera work is foreshadowing Shane saying this is his worst nightmare with this ominous shot of the camera panning through the kitchen behind David's head, akin to a horror film, which is strategic because we are denied the immediate recognition of David and more so view him as a potential threat. And it's preparing us for that feeling of dread that Ilya and Shane have. And with this camera angle, we are placed in David's POV, watching Shane and Ilya pushed up against the glass with Ilya's hand on Shane's butt. And we know as viewers that David has absolutely no room for ambiguity here. He knows what's happening. Putting the glass between them also creates that sense of them being watched without permission. It creates both a visual and physical separation of David impeding on Shane and Ilya's world, but not completely entering it. Before Ilya spots him and says, "Oh," the camera angle changes so that we can see what Ilya sees, which is David looking away, trying to act like he didn't see them, and then backing out of the kitchen and heading out the door. This is when Shane starts to hyperventilate. And I love that when they finally walk through the slider, it's like they are forced to address this seismic shift taking place once the door is open. Ilya says, "Maybe you should," and he leaves it open-ended so that Shane can decide what he wants to do next. And Shane says, yeah, but remains frozen, which we know he does because we've seen him do it multiple times now. Ilya then offers, "Do you want me to?" because he's providing a solution since Shane is unable to provide one for himself. And that's what makes Shane jump into action and say no, and go inside. And Ilya stays behind him because he does not know what Shane needs right now. He's letting him lead, and he doesn't want to assume what Shane needs from him. I love this one shot because we can see him clenching his jaw and puffing out tight breaths, and he's walking after his dad, watching him drive away from him before he has the opportunity to say anything. The camera doing this quick pan, one shot, and then the tense music playing over as he walks outside after his dad, it lets the gravity of the situation fall over him and us as a viewer because he does not have control over this. He loses the chance to explain himself. And to add to that ominous feeling, we can see Ilya standing alone in the house, perfectly framed by the window, because he's only meant to be there as a support right now for Shane. He is letting Shane dictate how he will handle this moment because it is about him and not about Ilya. I say this often with the show, but the sound mixing is really great here because the music cuts off very suddenly when we get the scene break and we are back inside the house. And it's a really nice wide angle shot of the house here where we can see Ilya standing in the middle of frame while Shane starts pacing. This is when Shane first says the line, "This is a fucking nightmare," and he hunches himself over the back of the armchair and we hear him yelling, but Ilya does not react. He just waits and lets Shane feel the feelings and have his reaction while he waits to see what Shane needs from him. He reassures him by saying Shane, and the delivery is not, "I need to fix it," or "I'm trying to minimize it." It's simply Ilya saying that he's there to support Shane, and he's waiting for Shane to invite him into this feeling. Shane repeats, "This is a nightmare," and moves to another location and does the same thing. He braces his arms on his head, then he puts them against the wall. He lets his head hang between his arms. He tries to regulate his breathing, and he's spiraling. He's repeating, "What am I supposed to do?" And this is Shane entering a full-on panic loop. His brain is stuck there. He's moving around while Ilya stays in one place, and Ilya doing that gives Shane a fixed anchor that he can use when he needs to, and Ilya knows that if he waits long enough, Shane will eventually orbit closer to him and he can be helpful. Ilya offers an option by saying we should go talk to him, and it's delivered very gently because he's watching Shane in this loop and trying to figure out how to help him get out of it. And Shane responds by saying, yeah, what if he doesn't want to talk to me? And his voice cracks when he says, what if, fuck, my mom? And Shane sinks down and puts his hands on his knees as that feeling overwhelms him. And this is where we learn the source of Shane's fear. He is afraid that his parents will reject him, of them loving him differently once they know, or that he's disappointed them to the point where they'll no longer speak to him. And that is what makes him collapse under the weight of that thought. Ilya then says, hey, they will talk to you, and reassures him. And I love that he uses hey here because we've heard Shane use that term with Ilya multiple times now. So it implies that Ilya has adopted that as a word to help self-regulate Shane. And Ilya has not moved from this spot in the middle of the room throughout this entire interaction. He is telling Shane with his words and his actions, they will not abandon you. And he's doing it without minimizing his feelings. Shane then says, but I lied to them. For so many years I lied to them, and now my dad just walks in on me. This is my nightmare. This is my actual nightmare, Ilya. And this admission tells us that Shane is terrified of his parents' disappointment over him lying to them for so long. He has also framed David walking in on him as part of the nightmare because he's never had the opportunity to write the script in his head of how this was going to go. Just like he's done with the Ottawa plan, he would have liked to have prepared ahead of time, and now that he doesn't have the plan to fall back on, it feels like he's free falling. That is when Ilya reaches out and touches Shane and says, okay, then maybe it's time to wake up, yes, which is such a beautiful way for Ilya to reframe the situation for Shane. He doesn't need to spiral in this loop. And Ilya being patient and waiting and guiding Shane through his feelings is what allows Shane's head to fall, and he breathes heavily, and Ilya then guides his hands out open for him and leads Shane's hands to his chest to help him ground his emotions. And that's when Shane walks into his arms and hugs him. And he admits, I'm scared. And Ilya is just so incredibly emotionally intelligent in this moment because he validates Shane by saying, yes, it's scary. And then he tells him, but you're brave. And telling him that is allowing Shane to realize that admitting his fear is what makes him brave. But he says, shut up, and cuts him off. And that's because being brave and admitting the emotion is scary. And Ilya reassures him by saying, you're brave, to try and ease that pressure. When Shane says, I feel like I'm going to die, he's pulling himself back from Ilya, but keeping his hands on his shoulders. I think so many people can relate to that feeling when you're having an anxiety or a panic attack, because it truly does feel like the world is ending. And when Shane says so much for easing them into it and makes this joke, he does it without making eye contact because the joke is meant for Shane. He's just trying to protect himself by deflecting and trying to incorporate some semblance of humor here. And Ilya looks at him concerned and he shrugs and follows the bit. So because in this moment Shane needs some levity, Ilya offers it to him. So he says maybe he didn't even notice with this smug look on his face, even though they both know that he absolutely noticed. He adds a little at the end to make Shane look at him, and he knows Shane will take this literally and then realize that he's joking. In the book, Shane actually admits that he had a plan to tell his parents soon that he was gay. He had planned to give them time to digest that, and then he would tell them eventually that he was in a relationship, that he was in love. And then once all of that settled with them, he would drop the real bombshell. But now everything was happening in the exact opposite order. He tries to formulate a plan and listing off action items for him to do, but he keeps getting snagged about what he's going to say. He's desperately trying to grab onto structure, just like he did with the Ottawa plan. And Ilya just observes him as he works through this in his head, and when Shane closes his eyes in frustration, he lets his head fall against Ilya's so that their foreheads touch, and Shane's hands are still on Ilya's chest because Ilya has made himself Shane's emotional anchor. Then Ilya offers, "Do you want me to come with you?" to try and fill in the plan for Shane because he's getting stuck, and Ilya offers him a building block. He's not trying to solve it, he's simply offering his help. And you can see that Shane is still holding on to him. So when he looks at Ilya and says, "Would you?" he asks it hopefully, because again, being brave and admitting he can't do this alone is new for him. Ilya says, "Of course," and shrugs and nods as though that's the most obvious thing in the world. And we can see him put his arm on Shane's bicep and squeeze it in reassurance off frame. And then we get one of my favorite callbacks of this entire scene, which is when Shane accepts Ilya's help here and whispers, "Okay," and nods again, and then whispers, "Okay," a second time, and Ilya mirrors it with a very nearly silent "okay." And we've heard them say that to each other so many times before throughout this series. It means something different now. And the plan doesn't need details anymore because Shane feels like he can navigate this without one, so long as Ilya is there to support him through it. Their foreheads touch again. Ilya runs his hands over Shane's shoulders and squeezes them, and Shane walks himself back into Ilya's arms, and their embrace is firmer now that Shane has stopped spiraling. And Ilya's still in the same position he started in when Shane nearly falls to his knees in front of Ilya. And Ilya lets him feel through that emotion. Even though Shane's whole world feels like a tornado, Ilya's the only thing that is steady and supporting him. This moment is showing us, instead of telling us what their dynamic looks like now, Ilya is letting Shane sort through the feeling and move through it instead of around it. And where Shane would have thought previously that not needing help, handling things alone, keeping total control over the situation is what it means to be brave, Ilya shows him here that being vulnerable is being brave. Shane can do that because Ilya's there and he's not alone in it anymore. After Shane and Ilya put some clothes on, we see Shane back in his emotional support button-up linen shirt. And in the books, he puts on a charity hockey camp shirt so that his parents will be reminded that he is a good and normal person. He tells Ilya that his Boston Raiders t-shirt is not going to help, and Ilya gives him a very serious but humorous response, "Oh, they don't know I play for Boston," which I think is so great because he's informing Shane that he's overthinking in a very direct but subtle way. Shane knows it's ridiculous, and so he doesn't even dignify Ilya with an answer. And I love both of their facial expressions as they're getting into the car, because Ilya is very much trying to make sure Shane pushes through this fear, and Shane's face is totally flustered. Also, the Raiders t-shirt says established 1924, which is the same year as the Boston Bruins. There is music playing over the car speakers, so the moment feels very intimate, and Ilya looks across at Shane while we are focused on Shane's eyes in the reflection of the rearview mirror. He's clearly worried, and we see his fingers tapping the gear shift, and Ilya puts his hand over Shane's to help calm him and ground him again and remind him that he's not alone as they head over to his parents' house. When he rubs his thumb over the back of Shane's hand, we've seen him do this multiple times as his own coping mechanism, and now he's making sure to do it with Shane. Once his hand touches his, Shane's eyes relax here, and we can see Ilya's head bow down to kiss the back of his hand, and we can see in Shane's eyes how he's responding to that, which I think is a really beautiful way to block this scene and shoot it, especially when you compare it to the top of the episode when we were watching them in the car for the first time together, and how differently this car ride feels now that they're headed to Shane's parents. Shane still looks very sad and defeated, but you know that he needed that very badly, and Ilya can sense that in him, and they're already establishing a really beautiful way of supporting one another through their emotions. We get one last close-up of Ilya's thumb on Shane's hand before we cut to a wide where the viewer is in the back seat and they are in the driveway, and Ilya opens his door first, but Shane is still frozen in place because Shane freezes. We've seen it time and time again. His hand shoots over to Ilya and he looks at him and says, maybe you should wait in the car. And Ilya's face here is one of total disbelief, and I love that he holds that expression to Shane to say, seriously? And Shane answers himself again and says, never mind, sorry, and rushes to get out of the car with him because Ilya is not letting him run away. Then the camera angle changes to inside the house with David and Yuna, and they are watching Shane and Ilya walk up the front steps with Shane leading and Ilya following him. And Shane is walking a lot quicker than Ilya. He looks back once to make sure he's following him, but you can tell that of the two of them, he's much more determined to get inside. We hear David say, and Una looks confused and looks at David before she stands up. And I love that you can see the desk here with Shane's trophies and his jersey on the wall, kid photos, because it reminds us that their entire house is filled with their pride for their son, and yet he still felt that they would never speak to him again if they discovered the truth about him. We hear Shane say, "Hey, it's me, Shane," as he enters his own parents' house, as though they wouldn't know who it is. And in the book, Shane says it was clear that his dad had told his mom what he'd seen. But I don't think it's as clear here, because David starts to explain to Shane, "I left my charger at your place. It's the only one that fits into my phone." And Una looks at him confused, then looks at Shane nervously. Then her eyes pan over to Ilya, and her eyes turn before her head. And it turns so slowly, it's as though a predator has entered into her house. And this shot of Ilya and Shane in the entry, shot over Una and David's back, puts them both in the center of the frame, and we see Shane with his thumbs hooked into his pockets like he does when he's nervous. And Ilya, for the very first time, we see him standing in a position that makes himself smaller. He's also slightly behind Shane. He has his stoic, hardened facial expression on briefly, and his legs are nearly together. I think it's important to remember that Ilya's association with parents and family is very different than Shane's, and he does not know what type of environment he's about to walk into when they enter this house. Upon first glance, I think Shane's family seems like a very tight and close-knit unit to Ilya, but again, he wouldn't know. Shane says, "It's okay, Dad, I'm sorry, you shouldn't have found out that way." And Ilya's eyes are moving back and forth between Una and David here. And again, he doesn't know Shane's family or any family really. He's only known his own, and he was always met with ridicule or insult or shame. So I do think he's genuinely nervous for how this is going to go, because this is very unfamiliar territory for him too. To me, David's face here implies that he isn't sure what he should or should not say in front of Una. And so Una is the one who asks, "Found out what exactly?" And she's looking between David and Shane. So again, I don't think she was given the whole story by David when he got home. I think he respects Shane's privacy and likely just made up an excuse as to why he was so flustered when he came home so quickly. But I do think he would have guarded Shane's secret. And again, there's this great role reversal where Una is the one that speaks firmly, and Ilya's eyes immediately cast down like he's bracing for her to berate them. And Shane just comes right out and says, "I'm gay, which I was going to tell you soon." In the book, they are both looking at Ilya like he was a mountain lion that was about to attack. Here I find that they are far more attentive to their own son. Shane says, "And this is Ilya Rozanov, but you already know that." And Ilya says hi in his very deep Russian accent, more thick than we've heard in a very long time, which I do feel like when he is feeling insecure or small, that comes out and is far more prominent. That's the first time that David finally looks at Ilya, and he nods very slowly while Shane explains he's visiting and we are. And in the book, Shane realizes that they hadn't even figured out what label they were comfortable with yet, and that's another sign of just how rapidly this is all unfolding for both of them. And that's when Ilya offers lovers and puts a hand on Shane's shoulder for support. I think it's also important to realize that in Russian, and I could be wrong, the word lovers means like dear or darling or soulmate. So it's definitely a term of endearment, which is why when Shane says, "No, Ilya, that's gross," and Ilya mouths, "Oh," once Shane clarifies, it would have been confusing for him that that word would not be appropriate. In the book, Shane thinks there's no going back from that word, and he could only wait for the aftermath, which is when Una says, "But you hate him." I think it's important to also recognize that for Una, her reality is now totally off base. Everything she has thought about her own son's career is now flipped on its head, because so much of his career has been central to this rivalry. And Shane says, "No, I mean, I get that, but no, I actually love him." And he shrugs and shakes his head because it's almost like, here goes nothing. I'm gonna lay it all out there. And for Shane, I think being gay and loving Ilya are synonymous. He can't say one thing without admitting the other. In the book, Shane says, "No, I don't. I mean, sometimes I do kinda, but mostly I love him actually." Una's face in this scene is pure surprise, and we see that with her eyebrows lifted slightly, and Shane says, "I did not want this to be how I told you. I'm sorry. And David is the one who shakes his head apologetically. And Shane asks, can we just sit down, please? I love Ilya and David's face here in this moment because David almost looks proud that Shane finally was able to say it, but ashamed that he's the reason it happened in this way. In the book, after Shane admits he loves Ilya, either one of his parents, it's not disclosed who, says, "You what?" And that's when Shane's heart starts racing and he asks, can we please sit down maybe? I do like that the show took a little bit of a softer approach to this because, as we'll learn as you watch the scene in its entirety, Yuna wrapping her head around this moment has less to do about Shane being gay and more to do about her not knowing that the rivalry was manufactured and having to reframe Shane's entire hockey career. The show has them sitting at the dining table, and I think that this is a really brilliant choice because it allows some very interesting camera blocking to take place. We saw more of Shane's photos on the wall. There's a warm orange glow around them. The window is overexposed, so the background is white, and Yuna serves everyone tea. Importantly, when Yuna walks around the table, she puts her hand on Shane's shoulders, which is a callback we will come back to a few times in this scene. David hardly ever takes his eyes off of Shane this entire sequence, and Yuna says, I think we thought maybe you were gay, and Shane is surprised and asks, you did? In the book, it's Yuna who says, we know you pretty well, and she gives him a small smile, and Shane says that the tiny gesture made him want to weep with relief. The show has Shane include the question for how long, because he's realizing that he was not doing as good of a job of hiding as he may have thought he was, and Yuna says, for a while, I guess. When they say that they had not been suspecting that he was so friendly with Rozanov, Ilya's face is so interesting here because he looks resolved to agree, but also scared by what that means, and so he humanizes himself by saying, Ilya. In the book, David says, Ilya then, and in the show, David says, Ilya, sorry. And what's great is that the second time David addresses him, he uses his first name, Ilya, and respects that boundary. Shane jumps in to say, I know, it's a long story, and he nods and looks over to Ilya for the first time, holding his breath, and Ilya looks back at him with support. And then when David asks, when did this happen, there's a pause, and Ilya lets Shane answer. And while David looks at Shane for the answer, Yuna is still looking at Ilya, because she is very territorial over her son. She does not understand how this could have possibly happened under her watch, and she's very off-put by the idea that everything has been a lie. In the book, it's Yuna who says, when did this happen? Wait, was it the All-Star game? You were on the same team. Here they have David be the one to point out that they had chemistry, and Yuna opens her mouth like she's putting the pieces together as well. But Ilya is already nodding his head no, and Shane is pursing his lips when he decides to share that it was before then. And Ilya smiles as he remembers it and looks over to Shane for more cues as to what they're going to say. David's eyes raise because he can't think of another moment to attach this relationship to, and Yuna starts slowly lowering her mug when David starts saying, wow, wow, wow. His body language of needing to sit back in his chair really emphasizes how they both are so surprised, but Yuna is almost defensive because she realizes now that this changes so much for Shane's career and for hers, so she's kind of resolved to say when in a very snippy way because she's also mad. Ilya does open his mouth to answer this question, but Shane says since our rookie season, and he can't even look at his parents as he says it. Yuna's eyebrows are nearly touching her hairline as she says, since your rookie season, and Ilya interjects finally with confusion on his face by saying, no, it's not true, since before that. In the book, Shane thinks not helping Ilya, but here he actually says not helpful. And Yuna really wants to get to the bottom of this, so she questions before, and Shane says the summer before, almost as if he's worried that Shane has forgot when they started this thing, which is more for Ilya than it is for his parents at this point. Yuna is looking at Ilya, but David is only looking at Shane, and then they switch when Yuna says, so you've been in love since, and leans forward, and both of them say no, no, no very emphatically in unison. Ilya laughs. Shane's trying to play it cool. It's important to remember that Ilya and Shane have not had this type of admission between themselves, so they are not about to do it and say those words for the first time in front of Shane's parents. So they default into the lie and shut it all the way back down because they haven't sorted through this answer yet on their own in their minds, even though we, as the viewer, know the answer to this question is yes. This funny moment where Ilya tries so hard not to say the word lovers again was added into the show, and I think it's a perfect comedic moment because Shane looks like he's about to slam Ilya's head into the table, and Ilya does not want to upset Shane, so he just refuses to say the word. Ilya shuts himself up by sipping his tea, and he's afraid to look at Shane when Yuna finally concludes, oh, okay. And David is still confused, so Yuna says lovers, and Ilya nods, congratulating her to arriving at that word without him actually having to say it out loud, and Shane is disgusted. This is the final nail in the coffin for Yuna because she announces to the table, well, I would love a drink. And this again is a change from the books because this does not happen in the book, but in the show, it's another way for us to see how Yuna distracts herself when she's overwhelmed with emotions. And David's eyebrows raise here because he knows that Yuna is going into her distraction mode, which is something that we have seen Shane doing when he's overwhelmed as well. And he looks knowingly at Shane because they both know that that's what is happening here. And when she walks away, she puts her hand on Shane's shoulder again as she walks by, and he puts his head down, and Ilya looks out the back doors. Yuna getting up from the table and saying, well, I would love a drink is different from the books. In the books, she says, is that the strongest thing we have? When David offers beer to the table. And there's a clear scene break where we go back to the familiar wide shot from the living room, which signals we're starting a new conversation by resetting the angle, and the show puts us back on the outside of the conversation again, so it feels more observational. We're not inside any one character's head yet, watching the dynamics of the room shift. David asks, and there were no nice men in Montreal, which in the books, this is Yuna asking this question. And Shane says, I don't know, probably there were. And his voice is up an octave. He's over being questioned, but it also implies he never looked for another man after meeting Ilya. Yuna asks, do your teammates know? And Shane says, no, nobody knows. And in the books, he gets exasperated and says, this is top secret, all right? And at that point in the book is when David gets up and says, would anyone like a beer? I could use a beer. Ilya says yes, Shane says definitely, and Yuna says, is that the strongest thing we have? We can see Ilya taking a sip of the vodka, and he acknowledges this is good vodka, and it draws our attention to the bottle on the table, which is the same brand as the bottle Ilya was drinking in Russia in the bathroom scene. In the book, Shane actually hates vodka, and after drinking it in the Vegas hotel room scene, he has that thought. So it's funny here that you can watch him sipping it in this scene and we see him grimace afterwards. But I also like the implication that now Ilya can drink the good stuff with David, this man who he thought was boring. At this point in the book, there's a beat where Shane and Ilya look at each other to non-verbally check in on how they think this conversation is going. Here, Yuna interjects by saying, you never let him win, did you, Shane? And Shane is angered by that, and Ilya looks to Shane to answer her honestly, because in the book, it's more of a humorous moment, but Yuna is deeply indoctrinated into hockey culture. She is the self-proclaimed biggest Metros fan, and so her reaction is meant to show us in a small way what the fan base would feel if they ever found out. Her first instinct is to protect Shane's legacy, the legitimacy of his career, and also the narrative of the rivalry because fans, teams, and the media have relied upon it for years, and so she's sort of stress testing Shane. If Shane ever had softened the way he played against Ilya, or the outcome of certain games had been affected by him being in love with Ilya, then Shane's career could be reinterpreted entirely and his success would be brought into question. Because Shane is not just a player on Montreal, he's the face of the franchise with a decades-long history and deep-seated pride, and this question is a way for Yuna to try and audit and retroactively reassess Shane's career. Shane counters with, do you let dad win at cards? Because he is entirely built on discipline and excellence, and so the implication that he is not those things would be deeply offensive. He's also just like Yuna, so he turns it around because they are the same. And she says, I'd rather die because winning is fundamental to her identity, and she knows Shane got that from her. In the book, Ilya makes a joke that Shane does not need to let him win, but they both understand that their relationship has never cheapened their careers. If anything, they would argue that it improved it because they loved playing and competing against one another so much. David is the one who forces the future into the room when he says, is your plan to what? Just keep doing this in secret until you both retire? And Yuna was keeping it in the past. Most of her questions are oriented in the past because she is in her own panic loop like Shane, and she's stuck there. So David is the one who's moving it forward. And importantly, he leaves that question open-ended for Shane and Ilya to answer. They have not had this conversation yet, so Ilya lets Shane take the lead here. And they look at each other quickly, and the focus pulls from Shane to Ilya so that we understand that we're meant to look at his reaction to Shane's words here. It subtly tells us that the answer to this question matters more to Ilya than anybody else in this room. So when Shane says probably, I don't know, he touches his nose, and that is historically one of Ilya's tells that we know he is now mirroring, which suggests that it may be untrue. And it's also not actually an answer. It's sort of a placeholder because Shane doesn't have an answer yet. And Ilya's eyes fall, and he hears Shane say this out loud to his parents, and then lags a little bit before he says probably yes, which I read more of Ilya surrendering his feelings on the subject to Shane here because there isn't an alternative being offered to them. I also think that this camera angle being the sides of their faces allows for a very cool narrative where Ilya is looking at Shane to gauge what Shane's reaction is, and we as the viewers can't see it, which puts us in the same boat as Ilya, where we are denied reassurance from Shane about this. And in the long game, we learn that Ilya has had a very different approach to this than Shane. He wants everyone to know he loves Shane, and Shane is not there yet, and that misalignment becomes a large issue for them moving forward. Yuna says, oh no, that's sad. And this is the first time someone else in the room says the quiet part out loud. And Ilya agrees and raises his eyebrows and then his hands in agreement. Like, I know, what else can we do? And then he has to look away and out the window and take a sip of his drink. And this is a tell that he's finding it very painful already to hide now that he knows how good it feels for someone to know. Shane agrees by saying, I know, we know, which again is acknowledgement, but it doesn't present a solution. And so Ilya sipping the vodka is self-soothing. And Shane says we can't just come out and announce it. Because again, they haven't discussed this, but the wording here matters because Shane saying can't frames it as an impossibility instead of a decision. And so for Ilya, Shane has just set a boundary or a rule that they can't announce it, which to him, who is imagining a future together now that Shane's parents know, is feeling like a door that had slightly cracked open for them is now being closed. Shane is trying to manage risk again, and Ilya is quietly absorbing the consequences of that, which is where we see for the first time that the way they plan to step into this new relationship together is not fully aligned, and how in this situation, Ilya is sort of getting the short end of the stick, which is what most of season 2 focuses on. This is when the story beat changes and David's head falls and he sort of collects himself before he addresses Ilya directly for the first time. And he uses Ilya's first name, like Ilya had asked, before he finally engages with him rather than evaluating him like they had been. And he says, Ilya, I gotta say I'm surprised you have such a reputation as a ladies' man. And you have to keep in mind that Yuna and David, being the parents of a player, they're not casual fans. They have attended industry events. They have been part of this wild ride that Shane is on. They've gone and interacted with other players and agents and management. And so they have internalized the persona that was built around Ilya. So him saying this isn't meant to be an insult so much as it is him trying to determine how much of Ilya's persona is manufactured alongside the rivalry now that David and Yuna know the rivalry is not real. Ilya answers honestly and says it's not untrue, which surprises Yuna because it's him being honest without being defensive, but it also adds another layer to her thinking about their relationship because Ilya confirms that he had also been sleeping with women throughout their entire careers. And Shane jumps in and says Ilya likes both because he wants to clarify, but he's also trying to control the optics. And Yuna says, oh, and she and David both process that and recalculate who they thought Ilya was, which parts were performances, which parts were the truth, and how that alters their understanding of Shane and Ilya being together now. So when Ilya continues and says it's true, I've been with many women, but I have only been in love with one person, that's him admitting that to Shane for the first time, which is why Shane looks at him surprised. And Ilya shyly meets his eyes. So initially he answers David and Yuna's questions, but he's also confessing this to Shane for the first time and being very vulnerable in front of two people who mean the most to Shane, which is a small way we see that Ilya is more willing to take big swings about their relationship and not keep it hidden from the outside world. And Shane here says, same here, only one. And again, this is the first time either has admitted this information to each other, and it puts them more on an equal footing. And Shane tries to mask his happiness from his parents because this moment is definitely more private for them. We know that Ilya is much more comfortable being himself and expressing himself in front of people he doesn't know, whereas Shane is far more reserved, especially in front of his own family. So beneath the table, we get a call back to their feet touching again. And Shane initiates it, but before he actually reaches Ilya's foot, Ilya turns his own foot and they meet in the middle. And that's as if to say, I'm here, I heard you, this was not lost on me. And then Shane putting his toe over Ilya's shoe is also just a subtle, cute display of possession. You're my person. And he reacts physically to this when he can't respond verbally and closes the gap that we just felt and saw with Ilya. In this wide shot, we can see Ilya and Shane's faces, but they're out of focus, which means they're not the center of the scene. David and Yuna reacting to them is what we're meant to be paying attention to here. And Ilya and Shane look at each other for a while before Shane's finally the one to look away. And he tells his parents with this interaction that their connection is undeniable. So David is now watching Ilya while Yuna is watching Shane. So we see them assessing them as now real people who are emotionally dealing with a very real situation and their love for one another. And it's a moment where we're finally starting to see them understand that this is real. It's not a secret fling. Shane saying he loves Ilya rings true now, and they can see that. And they've also now been told by Ilya himself that his feelings are mutual. Yuna is overcome by that realization and pushes herself away from the table. And she goes into the kitchen, and this time she does not put her hand on Shane's shoulder. And she takes 2 glasses from the table so that she cannot. Like Shane, she's grasping for order and control over something because the implications of this are overwhelming to her. She needs to self-regulate, and Shane can feel that this is different now because Yuna can't comfort Shane when she hasn't processed her own feelings yet. And Ilya, we see, busies himself with the vodka glass because when his emotions are too big, he tends to fixate on objects, make small repetitive actions to try and blend in, not be imposing. And Shane looks at his dad desperately, like, what have I done? Is this wrong? Did I say too much? And David watches Yuna from the table and knows that she's busying herself again to deal with those feelings that are overwhelming to her. And like Ilya did for Shane, he stays quiet and lets her do this while he becomes the emotional anchor in the room by staying seated and stationary and quiet. This visual of Yuna not being at the table shows us that there's a loss of something here that we get to explore in the scene that happens between Shane and Yuna after this one. The scene between Shane and Yuna is one of my favorites because it is not from the books. This is something written entirely by Jacob Tierney, and I have to say it's probably one of the best scenes of the whole series because this shot of Shane's face after Yuna leaves the table and David's reaction sets up this really key moment where we're wondering how this is going to get repaired between them. And then this devastatingly simple but poignant scene takes place outside. When Shane walks out the front door with Yuna's sweater, he actually swears under his breath, and we can see Yuna turn, and when she sees that it's Shane, she takes a deep breath to collect herself, wipes her eyes, and puts on a mask that we've seen Shane do time and time again. Shane bringing her sweater from the chair is similar and a callback to him bringing Ilya the blanket earlier on in this episode. And this scene is framed perfectly because they start out standing side by side facing forwards, and neither can look at each other fully. There is so much to the character of Yuna that I plan to do a deep dive into because I think it's hard to convey the depths of what she's feeling in this one scene, although I do think they've done a very good job of capturing the essence of it. And it also serves the function of showing us as viewers just how similar Shane is to Yuna now that we better understand the way that Shane copes emotionally and deals with his feelings. Yuna opens her mouth to say something multiple times, which is her attempt at recalibrating. But to Shane, her being silent would feel like validation that she's disappointed. So because she's not speaking, Shane goes on the defense by initiating the conversation first. He's trying to manage the moment before she can confirm his worst fears. When Shane finally says, "Mom, I need you to know that I did really try," the delivery breaks my heart because it's almost a question. And then he continues and says, "I tried really hard, but I just can't help it, and I'm sorry." As he makes this admission, he slowly turns his body towards her, and we get this great physicality of his jaw clenching like he's bracing for her words already. And it's important to remember that to Shane, trying is what Una taught him. Trying is what she rewarded his whole life. And Shane is not responding to anything that Una has said here. He's responding to what he assumes she believes about him. The word try is so loaded because it implies that he had been measuring himself up against this standard of being straight that he was always going to fall short on. It also implies that him being straight and feeding into the archetype of a hockey player is a part of it, yes, but it's mainly the persona that Una herself had built for him and feeling like it was an obligation that he could not meet or something he couldn't opt out of. Him saying, "I just can't help it," is equally devastating here because even though his identity is something he cannot control, he feels deep guilt over it. And for Una and Shane both, control is fundamental to who they are. And this is something that no matter how hard he would have tried, Shane would not have been able to control. That would have been incredibly difficult for him to wrestle with. He would have been doing mental gymnastics, trying to figure out how to control this side of him. And Una and him are the same. So it's no wonder that he would have believed that she shared the same internalized shame that he had felt about himself. Once Una realizes what Shane is saying here, her heart is breaking on screen, and she says, "Oh no, you have nothing to apologize for. Look at me, look at me." This is a way that she's recognizing and acknowledging his pain, but also trying to make sure that Shane understands exactly what she says and means when she addresses this. She's trying to wrangle Shane so that he will make eye contact with her because this is serious. And Shane can't look at her though. He keeps looking anywhere but at her until she demands it a third time. When Una says, "I'm sorry that I made you feel like you couldn't tell me," her face is so sincere and she's taking total accountability for her actions because even though everything she does and did for him was out of her intense love for him, she indirectly created an environment where Shane did not feel safe enough to be himself. And she realizes in that moment that Shane has been measuring himself against her expectations, even when those expectations were never explicitly stated. Shane's tears and his eyelashes in this scene is yet another unbelievable example of Hudson Williams' acting chops because it's not only raw and vulnerable, but it really matters that he had done this throughout the season because when he finally allows himself to close his eyes, these are the only tears that we see physically rolled down Shane's face in the entire show. This is a man who does yoga, meditates, and actively tries to implement practices into his routine to optimize his performance, but also regulate his emotions. All of those things are so that he does not have big emotions. And so for this to be the thing that makes him fully cry in the show is momentous because his deepest fear was rejection from his mother. And he can finally release that burden once she makes him finally feel safe enough to do so. Una says hey, which is where we now know Shane gets the word hey from as an affectionate gesture. And then she follows it up with, "I'm so, so proud of you." And this is such a powerful line because it piggybacks off of Ilya calling Shane brave at the house. So both Ilya's words and Una's words here are reframing Shane's vulnerability in these two moments as achievements worth celebrating. And her making direct eye contact is another way for her to make sure that Shane does not leave this conversation feeling any shred of doubt about where she stands and how much she loves him and how much she regrets her actions. This hug is so sweet because Una says, "Please forgive me," and allows herself to cry. And her saying this to Shane for the first time in their dynamic thus far, both in the show, from what we've seen, but also likely in Shane's life, is when Una fully hands over the power to Shane. She's no longer the authority here emotionally. And Shane's face over her shoulder is so heartbreaking because he lets himself cry again and then immediately says, "I forgive you, Mom," which makes Una smile. And then he follows it up with, "I love you," which to me conveys just how badly he wanted this moment between them, but also that Shane loves his mother without all of the outside things she does to protect him. His love of her is not conditional on her protecting him from the world. He just needs his mom to love him for who he is. So when she says, "I love you too so much, are you okay?" This is a healing moment between the two of them, But then it's also an example where we get to see where Shane gets so much of his emotional regulation tactics from, because they both try to pull themselves together quickly so that they can focus on what's important, which is formulating a plan. One thing I did want to highlight here is that I really love the music choice in this scene. It's a sound that we haven't heard throughout the series yet, and it feels very much like meditative music, like a wash of calm falling over the two of them, because there's equilibrium again between them. And one thing that Yuna and Shane have in common is that the two of them do not sit in their feelings. They like to move on from them quickly. And this is the coping strategy that Yuna has modeled for Shane for his entire life. So when something is painful or overwhelming, they both contain it and control it and try to mitigate it through a plan. It should be more obvious to us as viewers because we just saw Shane do this same thing not that long ago in the same episode, and that parallel of how the two of them self-regulate is meant to be very clear here. Shane's identity and his relationship with Ilya has now been accepted by Yuna, and that can be put on a shelf. The next threat is the hockey optics, and that's something that's very complex and Yuna understands quite deeply. And so the need to plan feels immediate for her, and we already know that it feels immediate for Shane because we saw him doing it earlier. What I love is that we know that while Shane and Yuna were out front having this conversation, Ilya and David are inside cooking dinner for the two of them. And Ilya and David are actually quite similar, I think, to one another in how they are partners to Yuna and Shane and in their approach. It's fun to imagine what the two of them were talking about because it would not be coming up with a plan. It would be being present and in the moment. And so you can see how Shane and Yuna's approach differs from Ilya and David's once they go back inside and are eating at the dinner table together. After Shane and Yuna finish their conversation, there is a clear tonal shift between this scene, the one we're leaving, and the one that we are re-entering, because it has healed in some subtle, unspoken way. And inside, we see pasta on the table. Ilya has a full fork, about to shove it into his mouth when Shane puts his hand on his wrist. And this gesture is meant to imply, please wait. And it feels instinctive because we've also seen his hand shoot across to Ilya in the car too. But Ilya shovels it into his mouth anyways, and this is such a great way to symbolize how his comfort has shifted because he is entirely unconcerned with table manners. He also ignores Shane's cue out of a comfort level as well, and just like how he says things like, "What? They don't know I play for Boston," or gives Shane the look that he does in the driveway before they got out of the car. Ilya understands when Shane is being serious versus when he's being slightly irrational. I think earlier in this scene at their house, he would have stopped when Shane put his hand on his arm, but now that he is comfortable and knows that Shane's mother and him have had their conversation outside, Ilya trusts that he is allowed to exist as himself here in front of David and Yuna. The argument can be made that David is a huge part of that because we know that while Shane and Yuna were outside, he and David were left alone inside, and David very likely invited Ilya to help him cook dinner because, as we know, he's the chef of the family. And inviting Ilya to cook or even just speak to him while David cooks dinner is a way of making Ilya feel included and bond, and also give him a task, treat him like a family member. And now that they know that he's a figure in Shane's life, that matters. Clearly, whatever David and he spoke about has made him feel far more comfortable, since that rigid stance and more nervous posturing he had in the lead up to this moment is gone and completely replaced with a childlike happiness to be shoving pasta into his mouth. When Yuna starts talking about PR statements, this is again because she processes things with plans and control over narratives, much like Shane does, and she wants to make sure that they have ownership over the narrative. Shane would rather have 5 minutes without worrying about it and being optimized. And Yuna bringing up all of the brands that he has deals with is meant to remind the viewer that Shane is the face of multiple large companies. So it's a great way to present the stakes here again, since they've not really been at the forefront of our minds for a while now. He has large contracts and brand deals and all of these other things to consider. Over the course of that interaction between Shane and Yuna, you see David put the cheese in front of Ilya. So again, he's silently making Ilya feel like he's welcome and included in this conversation. When Shane says, "Mom, can you take 3 steps back, please? I'm not going to come out or anything yet." He looks at Ilya, who could not be happier in this moment if he tried, and it seems so uncharacteristic for him to smile just a few moments ago. And then Shane says, we just want a future. I don't know. This is Shane drawing a boundary and using his own agency to set the pace of things. He's being cautious, but he also wants to remind Yuna that he is a unit now alongside Ilya, and these decisions have to be made for the both of them, not just Shane. Ilya smiling when he says that is so sweet because it's all either of them have wanted but have been denying themselves in so many of their internal thoughts throughout the book. But when Shane ends that with I don't know, it's slightly telling because he doesn't know what that future could even look like still. All he knows is it's not a press release. This is when Yuna pauses and looks suspiciously at Ilya because up until this point, the plan was mainly about Shane. And Ilya is a variable in that plan. She's just still not sure about him. So if Shane is telling her that any plan has to involve Ilya, she wants to make sure she knows if he's going to be a complication or not and how serious he is. One way we can tell that there's been a passage of time between when Shane and Yuna go back inside and where this scene picks up is because she already knows about the Ottawa plan. And in the book, Shane told his parents that they had an idea and outlines the Ottawa-Montreal plan after Ilya and Shane admit that they've only been in love with one other person, which is each other. And in the books, David says that isn't bad. In the show, after Yuna questions you'd play in Ottawa, Ilya doesn't hesitate before he says, yes, we will be closer and with the charity. And this is important because for Yuna, this is a metaphor really for Shane disguised as hockey talk. Because surface level, yes, Ilya leaving Boston for Ottawa would be a huge downgrade for him, and he would basically be forfeiting his chances to win another cup. It's to a team that hasn't made the playoffs. They don't have the same legacy as Boston. They're really bottom of the barrel. And for Ilya to give up playing on the team that drafted him is obviously a serious question about loyalty, but ultimately it's loyalty to Shane. So when Ilya just says yes, again, without hesitation, it really doesn't leave any more room for Yuna to question him, which is why she can only answer with, And so when Shane interjects, she says loyalty is important, and Shane says he's trying to be loyal to me, not Boston, and corrects her, which is a great line because it puts Shane in a really powerful position as someone who is worthy of this level of upheaval in Ilya's life. And that's only possible because Ilya has made him feel that important and loved and someone worth choosing. When Shane looks at Ilya, he already has a smirk growing on his face as he's continuing to shovel pasta into his mouth. And he says, my mom cares a little too much about hockey, which is a great line from the book because it's humorous, but it also downgrades the fact that Yuna's actually just really intense. But her response is also representative of the fan base because, again, understanding how fans would react to this is important context leading into season 2. Shane jokingly saying this also allows Ilya to feel more comfortable enough to joke back about her by saying, now I see where you get it from. He isn't intimidated or off-put by her reacting this way. He already understands Shane, so I think he very quickly understands Yuna. David asks, have you talked to Scott Hunter, which is different than the books. In the books, it's Yuna that says this, and this functions as David putting an end to that line of questioning and pivoting it towards how this situation might be making Shane feel rather than the hockey optics. Switching this line to David's allows him to be the one to use this question as that pivot point in the conversation. It's a hockey adjacent question, but it's one that moves towards Shane's feelings rather than what Yuna was doing, which is mitigating the response to him coming out. And David knows this is something that Shane's already said he's not ready to do. When Ilya says, I spoke to Scott Hunter, Shane's surprised, and he says yes briefly at the MLH Awards in June. This is a recycled piece of dialogue from a separate scene early on when Shane and Ilya are at the cottage together, and they have this conversation privately. Shane talks about having emailed Scott afterwards, and Ilya talks about going to a gay club with him after the awards to celebrate. Here, it implies that Ilya is already kind of a step ahead of Shane in terms of being more visible within hockey around Scott, which would make this whole thing not feel as abstract to Shane anymore. Yuna asks, what did he say? And Ilya says, nothing. I did not tell him about Shane and me, but what he did was, and Yuna finishes, yes, it was very brave, which is a show-added line of dialogue. In the book, Shane's the one that delivers these lines in a slightly different version. He's the one who says that Scott made him feel brave enough to try to be happy. But giving these lines to Ilya makes it clear that he is protecting Shane's timeline, and he wasn't going to disclose anything that Shane wasn't comfortable with. It's also reassuring Shane indirectly that Ilya is capable of keeping this a secret and respecting Shane's privacy. But when Una calls Scott's actions brave, it's also a great callback to Ilya calling Shane brave, and it puts them in the same category, meaning that now both Ilya and Una have called Shane brave directly and indirectly, which for Shane, hearing her speak so easily about Scott versus how he thought she might think about him in his own head, would be overwhelming, on top of the fact that Ilya has spoken to Scott already. Everything is happening so much quicker and out of order for him than he would have wanted, which is when his panic loop starts. In the book, he says the secret was out and they were talking about Shane and Ilya as a couple, and Shane suddenly felt a little lightheaded. David's the one watching him across the table because he's always attuned to Shane's emotions like Ilya and is very observant. And he doesn't interrupt Ilya, who's talking, or call attention to it. He just holds his gaze to see what Shane needs. When Una notices, she has a similar freeze response to Shane where she goes quiet and puts her fork on her plate, but she doesn't rush in there this time. The key here is that in this kitchen, nothing bad is happening, but the conversation existing at all feels like a free fall for someone like Shane who so deeply compartmentalizes every facet of his life. But Ilya continues talking and says it changed things, for me at least, maybe for us, and that's when he notices Shane slumped over in his seat. And he doesn't look panicked or concerned. He just looks at Una and David again to signal that they don't need to step in here before he recalibrates, takes over, and starts supporting Shane. I think this is a great way to very subtly mirror how David is responding in this scene too, where both of them don't overreact. They just observe and then see how they can be helpful. He puts his hand on Shane's thigh to physically ground him again, and he's probably doing the knee squeeze we've seen him do a few times now before he says Shane to reorient him. And Shane says, I'm okay, I'm just freaking out. And Ilya then moves his hand to Shane's back and the back of his neck, and Shane says, I'll be okay in a second, before Ilya says, hey, which we now know he learned from Shane, because that's how Shane soothes others. And the way that he reassures Shane here that he doesn't need to panic is so beautiful, because he says, we're good here, your family is here, your boyfriend is here, you're good here, okay? And he continues rubbing the back of Shane's neck until he can leave that panic loop. Him telling him where he is and who he's with and what the environment is so beautifully done. And the whole emotion of the scene falls on Shane asking, my boyfriend? And the delivery is so hopeful, and he glances over at Ilya so subtly, because to Shane, this label means everything. He desperately wants it to be true, and in the book, he thinks it's such a ridiculous word, such a ridiculous, wonderful word. In the book, he had imagined privately to himself many times what it would be like if Ilya was his boyfriend, so this moment is huge for him. The fact that all of these things leading up to this moment would not lead Shane to believe that Ilya could be his boyfriend is also incredibly endearing. Ilya saying, I mean, yes, I think so, probably, is such an interesting dialogue choice, because in the book, he just says yes. And so this added dialogue of I think so, probably, it's a word that comes up multiple times throughout the series for him, so it's definitely a narrative callback. I think it's also a way to ease Shane into the idea of it rather than a blunt yes. But what I love most is that he tilts Shane's face to his and kisses him again before rubbing the back of his neck one last time firmly, and then sitting back in his own chair. He sort of punctuates the moment and then moves on because he doesn't want Shane to dwell and stay in that panic loop. And the way he brushes his hand over the back of Shane's head is just so sweet. It's such a simple moment that shows Una and David that Ilya's love for Shane is action. He's so confident in de-escalating things with Shane. He doesn't hesitate to kiss him in front of Shane's parents. They just watched his love be a verb. So when Una smiles and says since rookie season, she's not surprised so much as seeing their dynamic clearly for the first time without her own biases of Ilya. In the book, Una also says, I can't believe it, and the show adds this great line of summer before from David, which of course is humorous, but in the books, he says, looking at them now, I kind of can. The music starts playing and we see Shane and Ilya heading back towards the car, and Ilya has his hand on Shane's back again as David and Una follow them outside. So this signals to us that we are leaving the dialogue-driven part of this scene and are now going to observe Shane and Ilya. Ilya having his hand on his back for a brief moment is another example of him grounding them because he knows how big of a deal this visit was. Una calls out, plans for the dinner the following night, and the context here makes it clear that they've accepted that this is the new norm and that Ilya will be a unit with Shane for all their future plans. And the line, "please text," is another example of Shane creating a boundary between him and his parents, which Una initially pushes back against by saying, "Why? We'll be there around 5. And then Ilya and David at the same time say, "Please text," and "we'll text." So again, that's another subtle way to show that the two of them are so similar. It's also a callback when he says, "Pay attention to your phones," because he's already been subjected to them and he doesn't need a repeat. Ilya says, "Thank you for pasta," cheerily, and that one sentence has so much gravity when you imagine that this is the first time Ilya has ever had a dinner like this with someone's family. There's a passage in the book where he reflects that he felt if he hadn't been already, he would be welcomed into Shane's family, which was no small thing for someone who had barely been welcome in his own family. Una saying, "Drive safely, I love you," and Shane saying, "I love you," and waving from inside the car is such a difference to when Shane was worried on the drive over and jittery. He had feared that Una's love for him would be complicated by him being gay, and now she says it easily and without pause, and that shifts the tone of the end of this episode into a very positive moment. But we still see Shane lean back in his seat and take a deep exhale when he starts the ignition, because this is the first time his body truly rests. And Ilya was already looking at him, monitoring him again, and so he reaches over to touch the back of Shane's head when he can see that Shane's eyes are closed. We can see that in the mirror as well, which is the third time this is a visual narrative in the episode. As the scene cuts and we go into the end credits with the song "Bad Things" playing over top, everything feels very optimistic and their relationship has been formally named. They've told Shane's parents and someone outside of the two of them knows about them and the sky didn't fall. And it all leads to this really beautiful end credit moment, which plays out very differently than how the book ends. The way that this show used the ending credits is such a beautiful way to punctuate the series, because we get to see Shane and Ilya in the aftermath of such a monumental moment in their relationship, because now someone on the outside of their relationship knows about them, which is a really important thing for them moving forward. It's also a big deal that someone outside of Ilya knows about Shane. Shane spends much of the book hopelessly dreaming about what it would be like for Ilya to meet his parents, and that has now happened. And Ilya never thought that meeting Shane's parents was something he'd be allowed to do. The way that the show chooses to end the series versus how the book ends is happy, in love, optimistic, and in part, this is meant to be their ride off into the sunset moment because we're contained within the car. Very likely it was shot this way because they didn't know at the time if they would continue the story with another season. But Jacob Tierney has said in multiple interviews that he wanted to make sure that he balanced the act of the storytelling so that the big moment with Scott and Kip is offset by this moment with Shane and Ilya in the car. It's a different way of showing that they have the happy ending as well. It's much smaller and more contained because we're inside the car with them, but it was the sweetest ending he could come up with for them for now. This is also another one shot and the longest of the show, and it helps to show us that Shane and Ilya's relationship is evolving and growing, but it also reminds us that everything outside their little bubble and insulated reality has changed. The cottage is removed from all of the struggles and realities that await them once they return to work. So now we can enjoy the moment with them and not end the series on tension like the book suggests. And Jacob really leaned into the sunshine metaphor that Scott and Kip have, where they are driving into a sunset bathed in this beautiful golden light and happy. We see them talking to one another throughout this car ride, which differs from the books because in the book, Shane actually doesn't talk the entire ride home. Jacob had given both Hudson and Connor direction to be Ilya and Shane after this drive. And in interviews, Connor and Hudson have both talked about the experience they had filming this. They did multiple takes, and in one of them, they were crying the whole time, thinking that that was the emotion that was appropriate here. And Jacob had them redo it because he wanted them to look happier. He really wanted to emphasize that they are having fun. We do see, though, that Connor has Ilya shed a tear in this scene. There's a single tear that you can see rolling down his cheek, but it's definitely the most blended the two of them are with their characters. There are parts of them peeking throughout this. Jacob really wanted to keep this simple and do something with just a bit of elegance. Driving off into the sunset is a little cliche, but this feels appropriate for the weight of what they've just gone through. And it does capture the essence of what the ending of the book does, which is that they're optimistic heading into this unknown future. Having the show blur the line between Hudson and Shane and Connor and Ilya in this final moment is also such a beautiful way to almost break the fourth wall with us fans and let the people who created the show and the fans who supported it enjoy the moment before we move into the next phase of the story together. Having all of the people who worked so tirelessly on this project as well have their names flash over this scene that they know everyone will be watching is also just a really classy way of sending the whole show off. And even though the characters are talking and we don't know what they're saying, Hudson has confirmed that they said a lot of things like, "I can't believe we've done this," "I love yous," "Wow, I can't believe we've done this," "I can't believe it happened." But for those who have not read the book, I do want to compare to how the scene ends in the story, because it takes place in Ilya's point of view, and he reflects that he's not sure how Shane felt about everything that just happened, but he had thought it had gone surprisingly well. Shane says, "Holy shit," and Ilya offers, "It was okay, yes?" And Shane says, "I don't know. Do you think it was? That was really weird." And Ilya has a very different emotional response to this experience than Shane, obviously. Ilya says, "Let's go home," and spends most of the car ride wondering if Shane thought it was weird that he had referred to Shane's cottage as home, because even though his grip on English was not that great, he didn't know if referring to a place he was only staying at for a couple weeks as home was strange, but Shane never says anything about it. Shane doesn't talk the entire car ride back to the cottage, and when they do get back, he says that he needs some air, and Ilya pulls out some vodka to drink between the two of them to try and calm Shane down. Where Shane expresses that this was one of the weirdest days of his life, Ilya thinks to himself that it had been one of the best days of his life. He felt like Shane's family would welcome him into it, and for someone like Ilya who wasn't welcome in his own family, that was a momentous feeling for him to experience. But he has this really great passage where he reflects that Shane is the closest he has felt to home. When he's with Shane, he feels like he's home. He had always been adrift in his life, and now he wanted to anchor himself to Shane and stay. He didn't know how to say that in English, and so he just says, "I love you," because that's what he could say for now, and he's allowed to say it now after so long. And while Ilya is having all of these really huge feelings flood over him, Shane says, "I keep thinking about logistics." And he's talking about how early Ilya would be in Ottawa, and Ilya doesn't want to talk about logistics at all. He just wants to be in the moment with Shane, which really tees up the long game. And because we don't get this ending in the show, very likely the first episode of season 2 will have to lay a lot of the groundwork, which is compounded by the fact that the epilogue of the book takes place 16 months after this moment. And in the long game, we are in July of 2020 because they are both 29 years old. Ilya thinks to himself that he's going to give up everything in his life for a chance at something lasting with Shane, and that he'd give up so much more if he needed to. But one of the most significant thoughts going through his head is, "I love you so much, don't leave me," which is a huge wound that I hope they explore in great detail in season 2, because this is not the first time in the book that Ilya has had a thought which emphasizes his fear around Shane leaving him, and that is a core wound. A couple of things that they talk about at the end of the book that I think they could very well be talking about in this car, if we want to be literal, is Ilya extends his stay beyond the 2 weeks, and they agree by the end of the conversation that Ilya will move to Ottawa, they will start the charity, they will become friends, spend as much time as possible with each other, and all of their summers there at the cottage. And Ilya has a thought that he can't believe they had solved this impossible problem, which I think is a great way to loop in where he likely pulled the word problem out of the source material to put it into the conversation Shane and Rose have. Ilya also uses this scene to tell Shane that after he retires and wins 12 Stanley Cups and 13 MVP awards, that he will bring Shane to the dock and propose to him so that he can get Canadian citizenship faster, as a joke. But he means it when he says he wants to marry him. The irony in that statement is that Ilya is leaving Boston. Going to Ottawa is essentially stripping Ilya of the chance to ever win a cup anytime in the near future, considering the state of the team at the time. Shane says he will say yes to Ilya's proposal because he'll still be madly in love with Ilya then, and Ilya thinks to himself he doesn't deserve Shane. So again, it's another thought of self-deprecation that Ilya has. And Shane reaffirms him by saying that even though he knows it will be awkward, he is playing the long game here, so a nod to the sequel book. I do plan to talk about some of the foreshadowing we've already seen for season 2, and knowing what happens in the long game, it is easy to sort of pinpoint where they could pivot things or adjust things. All of that to say, when you consider how loaded the end of the book is, it does feel nice as a viewer to end the season on this note instead of worrying about all of these things that Ilya in the book is worrying about. To freeze time and focus on the happiness they feel here instead of the anxiety is something that I think in a lot of stories like this we don't get. And that creative decision ends this series with a really beautiful punctuation mark. And knowing that we're not left on a cliffhanger makes it all the more fun to speculate how they're going to open season 2, what they're going to pull out of the end of this book or the epilogue, even some of the bonus scenes that Rachel has written on her website. I can't wait to talk about all of the different directions they could take things and some of the scenes that I really hope that we see in the next season, because I would argue that season 2 is going to have a very interesting task ahead of them to try and take so many internal thoughts that both of these characters are having and find creative narrative ways to show us instead of tell us what they're thinking and feeling. But as evidence by this beautiful 6-episode series, I have all the faith in the world in Jacob and the team that they will come up with something really compelling and beautiful. And in the meantime, we can celebrate just how special this show is and how wonderful both Hudson and Connor have been as Shane and Ilya.